In 1993, Princess Margaret stood in the garden of Kensington Palace and burned 30 years of her own letters. Her chauffeur of 26 years stood beside her and watched. He later wrote that she fed the pages into a dustbin fire, one by one, methodically, without expression, until there was nothing left. A woman with nothing to hide does not do that. What she destroyed took with it the private record of the most documented and least understood royal life of the 20th century. Because the public version of Princess Margaret, the tragic beauty who gave up the man she loved for duty, the glamorous wreck who drank too much and stayed up too late and died too young, was a construction built by a woman who understood, better than any press officer alive, the difference between a story that serves you and a story that exposes you. Here is what the construction was built over. In 2004, the British National Archives released the Cabinet Papers from October 1955, the month Princess Margaret announced she would not marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. The world had spent 49 years believing she had no choice, that the church, the government, and her sister had closed every door. The files showed that by October 1955, the government had a plan on the table under which she could have married Townsend, kept her title, kept her income, and stayed in England. The Prime Minister was not opposed. The Queen had privately said she would not stand in the way. The path was open. She did not take it. Nobody has ever adequately explained why, and this account will. That is the first thing the construction was built over. The second is a note her husband left in her chest of drawers, which her lady-in-waiting recorded word for word in a memoir published in 2019. The note said, "You look like a Jewish manicurist, and I hate you." She had stopped opening her own drawers by then, sending her maid first, because the notes were the least of it, and she had learned to absorb the worst of it in private. The marriage lasted 18 years. The cruelty inside it ran in both directions, and the specific texture of what both of them did to each other, documented by the people in the rooms where it happened, is the second thing the public version of Princess Margaret was built to prevent you from seeing clearly. The third is the photograph. February 1976, the news of the world. Princess Margaret on the beach at Mustique, with a 26-year-old gardener named Roddy Llewellyn, 18 years her junior, published while she was still technically married to someone else, and it detonated the most serious public argument about royal expenditure since the abdication. And what the argument found, when it went looking, was arithmetic that the palace had been hoping nobody would do. The fourth is the staff. The people who served her left accounts that Craig Brown spent years collecting for his 2017 biography, and what the accounts describe, in the specific language of people who cannot be sued by the dead, is a woman who deployed her rank the way other people deploy furniture, to establish who owned the room. The put-downs were timed. The cruelty was creative. The cigarettes burned all night, while footmen stood, because she had not given them permission to sit. She was also, by the testimony of the same people, one of the most genuinely gifted human beings any of them had ever served. The piano, the mimicry, the wit, the conversation that could hold a room of the most famous people in the world, and make every one of them feel they were the only person in it. Both things were true simultaneously, and the tragedy the public received was the editing of both into one, the brilliant woman undone by forces beyond her control, which is a cleaner story than the one the files and the letters and the staff accounts assemble when you read them together. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Margaret Rose Windsor was born on the 21st of August, 1930, at Glamis Castle in Scotland, in a thunderstorm, 4 years after her sister, and the order of her arrival determined every subsequent fact of her existence. She was not the heir. She was the other one, the decorative one, the one the photographers positioned slightly behind and to the left, and the family understood from the first weeks what the positioning meant. Elizabeth would carry the institution forward, and Margaret would carry everything else, the wit, the beauty, the personality, the inconvenience. The institution had no formal job description for everything else. It would spend the next 7 decades improvising one, and the improvisation would cost everyone involved more than anyone admitted at the time. The world into which she arrived was not the world of palaces and protocol that her adult legend would suggest. Her father, Prince Albert, Duke of York, was the second son of George V, a shy, stammering man who had spent his life preparing for a role he was never supposed to occupy, and whose household at 145 Piccadilly ran on the rhythms of the upper-middle-class professional family it essentially was. The Duke drove his own car. The children had a nursery governess, Marion Crawford, who became the girls' primary adult companion across their early years, and who would later publish, under the name Crawfy, the memoir that the family considered the first great betrayal of their privacy. Crawfy's book, dismissed by the palace for decades as the work of a disloyal servant, is in fact the most detailed surviving account of Margaret's formation, and its portrait of the younger princess, assembled from years of daily observation, is the document this part of the account begins with, because it is the document in which the adult character first becomes legible. What Crawfy saw, and recorded with the affectionate precision of a woman who genuinely loved both children, was a girl of extraordinary gifts, operating inside a world organized around the premise that her gifts were secondary. Margaret's intelligence, she wrote, was of the quick, oblique kind that formal education cannot easily accommodate. She absorbed everything, retained it without apparent effort, and grew bored with the pace at which institutions require knowledge to be delivered. She had perfect pitch, a musician's ear that her piano teacher described as the finest she had encountered in a student of any age, and a talent for mimicry so exact that she could reproduce, after a single hearing, not merely a person's voice, but the specific social anxieties encoded in it. She made her family laugh until they wept. She made them uncomfortable in the same breath, because the mimicry did not spare anyone in the room, and the intelligence behind it was always several steps ahead of the conversation, and the people being mimicked were sometimes still present. Crawfy recorded an early incident that has been repeated in every biography since, not because it is dramatic, but because it is diagnostic. The young Margaret, perhaps 6, was told by a visiting adult to perform at the piano for the company. She declined. The adult pressed. Margaret looked at the person with the specific quality of attention that her biographers would describe, in her adult years, as the precursor to devastation, and produced a remark so precisely calibrated to the visitor's social pretension that Crawfy, writing from memory, still felt the temperature drop. The visitor laughed, uncertainly. The king, who had witnessed the exchange, caught Crawfy's eye. The exchange between them, wordless, said what it needed to say. They had both seen what the child was, and neither of them was entirely sure what to do with it. Her grandfather, George V, had no such uncertainty. He adored her with the uncomplicated ferocity of old men for small girls who make them laugh, called her the most amusing child in the country, and gave her the specific advantage and the specific damage of being the grandparents' favorite in a family where the parents' favor was more qualified. George V died in January 1936, when Margaret was 5, and the sequence of events his death set in motion, the accession of Edward V, the abdication 11 months later, the unwanted elevation of her father to the throne, arrived in the life of a child too young to understand them, and old enough to absorb their emotional texture entirely. What she absorbed, in the months between December 1936 and the coronation of May 1937, was a lesson about the relationship between love and institution that would organize the next 6 decades. Her father, who had not wanted the throne, whose health the throne would destroy, whose stammer her mother had to manage through every public occasion, became king, not because the family chose it, but because the institution required it, and the requiring overrode everything else: the father's wishes, the family's comfort, the younger daughter's understood future as a private person of moderate public duty. The abdication made Elizabeth the heir, and Margaret the spare, and the word spare carries inside it the precise information the family and the court would spend Margaret's lifetime failing to act on. A spare is kept, maintained, and deployed as needed, and is not the primary concern of the institution that holds it. The coronation photographs tell the story with the efficiency that only images achieve. Elizabeth, 7 years old, solemn and aware of her weight, looking at the camera with the steadiness of someone who has already understood her life's assignment. Margaret, 6, looking sideways at something off-camera, vivid and uncontained, wearing an expression that the decades' worth of formal royal photographs could never quite discipline into the institution's preferred blankness. The expression is attention, turned outward, restless, already looking for whatever is more interesting than what has been arranged for her to look at. It would never stop looking. The years at Windsor Castle during the war, from 1939 to 1945, produced the period of Margaret's life that even her harshest biographers treat with the closest thing to tenderness, because the Windsor years were the years of genuine family enclosure, the four of them in the castle while the country burned outside, the king and queen making their morale visits to the bombed cities and returning to Crawfey and the girls, and the domestic life of a family that was, by every account of the period, real in its affections and specific in its pleasures. The theatrical entertainments the girls organized, the pantomimes staged in the castle's Waterloo chamber, with costumes Margaret designed and dialogue she substantially wrote, are documented in the programs that survive, and in Crawfey's account, and in the recollections of the invited audiences, and they are the clearest record of what Margaret was, before she became what the institution made of her. A performer of genuine creative intelligence, working at the edge of her ability, in full command of every room she occupied. She was also, by the same accounts, already establishing the habits of hierarchy that the adult record would document at length. The castle's household staff were objects of her mimicry and her condescension in measures that Crawfey recorded with the careful neutrality of a woman who understood that the child she was describing would one day read what she had written. The footmen who participated in the pantomimes were directed, not invited. The invitations issued for the royal entertainments carried the implicit understanding that declining was not an available option. Margaret, at 12, had grasped what the institution conferred, the right to require. She would spend the next 60 years exercising it, in settings of increasing grandeur and diminishing legitimate claim, and the exercising would become, for the people in its path, the defining fact of the acquaintance. Her relationship with her sister across these years was the relationship that all subsequent biographers and dramatizations have returned to, because it was the primary relationship of both their lives, and its terms were established in childhood and never fundamentally revised. Elizabeth was older, steadier, and possessed of the specific quality that Margaret, for all her gifts, entirely lacked: patience with the institution's demands. Where Elizabeth submitted to protocol with the genuine conviction of someone who understood its function, Margaret submitted to it with the specific performance of someone doing a favor, and the distinction, invisible to outsiders, was acutely visible to the family and the household. The Queen, their mother, managed the distinction with the social skill she brought to every difficulty, but the management cost something, and the cost appeared in the accounts of people close to the household as a particular quality of tiredness that surrounded anything involving Margaret's schedule, Margaret's requirements, Margaret's opinion of the occasion. Her father watched her with the compound feeling that parents have for the child who is most like them. George VI was not a patient man. His temper, controlled at enormous cost in public, emerged in private in ways his household recorded, with the careful discretion of people who served an institution rather than a person. He recognized in his younger daughter a version of his own intolerance for the machinery, and it appears, from the accounts of those who observed them together in the final years of his life, that he could neither discipline it in her nor bring himself to try very hard. The king's men recorded the king's daughters as inseparable in his affections, but the records also show which daughter he summoned when he wanted to be amused, and it was not the heir. He died on February 6, 1952, in his sleep at Sandringham, at 56, worn through by a war and a throne he had not asked for, and the cigarettes that his daughters had watched him smoke every day of their visible lives. Margaret was 21, Elizabeth was 25, and became queen the same morning, and the elevation of her sister, that second coronation of the family's hierarchy by death rather than choice, produced in Margaret a grief that the people around her described as differently textured from ordinary mourning. She had lost a father. She had also lost the one person in the institution who had loved her without the institution's qualifying conditions, who had found her mimicry funny rather than pointed, who had not required her to be anything other than the most entertaining person in any room she entered. After February 6, 1952, the institution had a new head, and the new head was her sister, and the relationship between them, however genuine its affection, was now organized around a hierarchy that the family had spent 2 decades maintaining. The hierarchy placed Elizabeth first in everything, and Margaret second, and the second position was not, as it had been in the privacy of the Windsor years, the position of the cherished younger sister. It was the position of the spare, with all the institutional ambiguity that the word carries, in a family and a court now entirely reorganized around the requirements of a new reign. She was 21 years old. She had more natural gifts than anyone who had ever served the institution she was born into. She had no defined function, no income beyond the civil list, no plan, and no precedent for what a princess royal, who was not the heir, was supposed to do with 60 more years of life. And somewhere in the household, in a uniform she had seen every day since childhood, was a man 15 years older than her, a Battle of Britain pilot with pale eyes and a quiet manner, and a marriage that had just, quietly, ended. His name has already appeared in this account's opening pages. What the next part of this account examines is not the love story, the version that the announcement of 1955 and the decades of sympathy that followed were built on. What it examines is what the 2004 files revealed about what the love story actually was, and why the woman who burned her letters in 1993 might have had specific reasons to make sure the answer to that question stayed in the dustbin fire with everything else. Peter Townsend entered royal service in March 1944 as an equerry to King George VI, and the appointment was the kind that the court makes without thinking very hard about its consequences, because an equerry is furniture, decorative and functional, present at the edges of rooms where the principal is the person wearing the crown. He was 30 years old, a group captain with a distinguished service order and a bar, one of the authenticated heroes of the Battle of Britain, a man whose face the war had left with the particular quality of controlled damage that the 1940s found irresistible. He was also, when he arrived at the palace, married, with 2 small sons, and the marriage was the kind of information the court noted and filed and did not think about again, because equerries' marriages were not the institution's concern. What the institution failed to note, and what Townsend's own memoir, Time and Chance, published in 1978, described with the retrospective clarity of a man who had spent 20 years understanding what had happened to him, was that the king took to him in the specific way that a shy, unwell man takes to someone who is both professionally competent and personally undemanding. George VI was surrounded by people who wanted things from him: attention, decisions, public appearances, the specific performance of monarchy that the war required. Townsend wanted nothing beyond the execution of his job, and the king, who had spent his reign giving everything to everyone, found in this a quality he could not name and did not need to. He kept Townsend close, he brought him on tours, included him in family occasions, and extended to him the informal warmth that the household's formal architecture normally prevented. Margaret observed all of this. She was 14 when Townsend arrived, 17 when the war ended, and the years between produced, in the hothouse enclosure of wartime Windsor, exactly the conditions in which a brilliant, underoccupied girl forms attachments to the adults who treat her as something more interesting than a royal obligation. Townsend treated her as someone worth listening to. The conversations they are recorded as having, by Crawford and by the household staff whose accounts the biographies collected, were not the conversations of a man managing a princess. They were, by every description, the conversations of 2 people who found each other interesting, which was, in that household, rarer than it should have been. His wife divorced him in 1952 on grounds of his adultery, and the divorce decree named a woman in the household, not Margaret. Townsend had been unfaithful, in the ordinary way of unhappy wartime marriages, and the divorce was the divorce of a man extricating himself from a situation that had been wrong for years before it became impossible. He remained in royal service, was appointed comptroller of the Queen Mother's household, and moved with Margaret and the Queen Mother to Clarence House after the King's death. The proximity that the court had not thought about when it appointed him equerry in 1944 was now the proximity of 2 adults in the same building, and the feeling that had been building across 8 years had, by the autumn of 1952, become the one thing in the building that everybody knew about and nobody was going to name first. The naming came from outside, and it came at the worst possible moment for the institution. On June 2, 1953, at the coronation of Elizabeth II, in Westminster Abbey, before the cameras of the world and the eyes of several hundred dignitaries, Princess Margaret reached up and brushed a piece of lint from the lapel of Peter Townsend's uniform. The gesture took 2 seconds. A single reporter from the agency press pool saw it, recognized its register, and filed it. By the following morning it was in print on 3 continents. The court, which had managed the situation for a year through collective silence, was now managing a story, and the story, once the press had named it, was not going to be unnamed. What happened next is the version history kept for 50 years. Winston Churchill, whose government was consulted, was opposed. The Church of England did not countenance the remarriage of divorced persons, and the princess was third in the line of succession, and a royal match with a divorced commoner was constitutionally inadmissible. Townsend was dispatched to Brussels as heir attaché, a posting that placed him in a hotel room in a foreign city, while the press of the world counted down the months to Margaret's 25th birthday, at which point the Royal Marriages Act of 1772 would, in theory, give her the right to choose for herself. She was 22 when he left. She would be 25 in August 1955. The 2 years had the narrative shape of a test, and the world arranged itself to watch her pass it. Here the standard version of events ends, and the 2004 files begin. The National Archives released the Cabinet Papers from October 1955 in January 2004, and the historians who read them found that the story they had been telling for 50 years was missing its most important room. The room contained a plan, drafted by the government of Anthony Eden, circulated to Commonwealth Prime Ministers, and shown to the Queen, under which Princess Margaret could marry Peter Townsend without losing her royal title, without losing her civil list income of £6,000 per year, plus an additional £9,000 on marriage, without leaving the country, and without being removed from public duties, subject to the approval of Parliament. The sole condition was the renunciation of her place in the succession for herself and any children. The plan was not a threat, it was an accommodation, drawn up by a government that had read the public opinion polls, which ran in Margaret's favour by margins that made opposition politically uncomfortable, and decided that the path of least institutional damage was to let her marry with the minimum of ceremony around the concession. Eden himself had been divorced and remarried. His own position made principled opposition to the marriage logically untenable, and he knew it. The Queen, according to the files and to the subsequent account of royal biographer Penny Junor, had privately communicated that she would not stand in the way of her sister's happiness. The Church of England's absolute opposition, which the 1955 mythology made the immovable wall of the story, was not in fact the government's position. The government's position was negotiated, workable, and on the table. The question the 2004 files force is the one this account's opening section promised. If the path was open, why didn't she take it? The answer exists in 3 separate documents, and the 3 documents together constitute the most revealing archive of Princess Margaret's inner life that the fire of 1993 did not reach. The first is a letter she wrote to Anthony Eden on August 15, 1955, 3 days before her 25th birthday. In it she told the Prime Minister that she had no doubt the press would speculate about her marriage intentions in the coming weeks, and that it was only by seeing Townsend again that she felt she could properly decide whether she could marry him. Read that sentence again. She had not seen him for 2 years. She was 3 days from the birthday that would theoretically free her, and she was writing to the Prime Minister to say she was not yet sure. The second document is a letter from Eden to Commonwealth Prime Ministers, dated later that same month, in which he relayed the Queen's position. Her Majesty would not wish to stand in the way of her sister's happiness. The Queen was not the obstacle. The third document is the plan itself, in its final form, demonstrating that the government was not the obstacle either. What the 3 documents together establish is that by August 1955, the 2 institutions the world blamed for the outcome had both moved to accommodation. What had not moved was the woman at the center of it. Townsend returned to London in October 1955. The couple met repeatedly across that month, in the houses of friends, and the accounts of those meetings gathered from the people who were present and recorded in Tim Heald's research and in Sarah Bradford's biography of the Queen, describe something that neither participant described in their own published accounts. They described two people who had spent 2 years apart discovering, in person, that the correspondence had preserved something the reunion was not quite finding. Townsend was 40, settled in Brussels, beginning to rebuild a life that the situation had suspended. Margaret was 25, living in Clarence House in the apartment below her mother, performing the public duties that the new reign assigned her, smoking through her mornings, and waiting for a resolution she had spent 2 years believing she wanted. What the October meetings showed, in the accounts of the people in the houses where they met, was the gap between the wanted resolution and the actual Townsend, a gap that 2 years of separated correspondence had papered over, and 10 days of proximity was now exposing. The statement was issued on October 31st, and it named Duty and the Church, and the world received it as the tragedy it was dressed as, and Princess Margaret received the world's sympathy in quantities that sustained her public identity for the next decade. The sympathy was real, the tragedy was partially constructed, and the construction served everyone involved with such precision that it is difficult to call it accidental. The institution was spared the spectacle of a princess choosing against a workable accommodation. Margaret was spared the more uncomfortable public narrative that she had spent 2 years certain she wanted something, found it available, and discovered in the presence of the actual thing that the wanting had been more sustaining than the having would be. And Townsend was spared, in public, from being the man a princess had chosen a title over, which is what the 2004 files, read plainly, suggest he was. He remarried in 1959, a Belgian woman named Marie-Luce Germaine, 19 years his junior, whom he described in his memoir as the woman who gave him what he had been looking for. He and Marie-Luce had 3 children and lived together for the rest of his long life. He died in 1995 at 80. Margaret sent no public word. In the memoir he published in 1978, he described the princess with a warmth and a precision that made clear he had cared for her genuinely, and he declined every invitation to say anything unkind. He was, by the consistent testimony of everyone who knew him, a genuinely good man, which may be the final and most useful fact about him, that the woman who was publicly mourned as his great sacrifice had looked at the plan that would have given him to her, spent 3 weeks in his company, and chosen the wound instead. The wound was manageable. It was, in the specific vocabulary of the institution she had been born into, useful. It gave her the one thing the spare's position otherwise denies, a story of her own, a role in the institution's narrative that was not simply defined by her sister's precedents. The tragic princess carried more public weight than the princess who married the divorced pilot and gave up her succession rights, and the weight was currency, and Princess Margaret understood currency in the specific and sophisticated way that people do when they have grown up watching an institution trade in it. What she spent the currency on, in the 5 years between Townsend and the next decision, is the next part of this account. The next decision was made on a rooftop in Rotherhithe, at a party thrown by an artist, by a man who arrived late and spent the evening across the room and left before she did, and who understood exactly what he was looking at, and what it was worth, and what it would cost him, and married her anyway. The party where they met was held in February 1958 in a terraced house in Cheyne Walk, Chelsea, hosted by Lady Elizabeth Cavendish, lady-in-waiting to Princess Margaret, and the kind of well-connected Englishwoman whose dinner tables mixed the aristocracy with the arts in proportions that made both sides feel they were slumming productively. The man who arrived late, stayed near the edges, and left before the evening ended, was 27 years old, the son of a Welsh barrister and a socialite mother whose second marriage had given him a stepfather with the title and the connections that his father's profession alone could not have provided. His name was Antony Charles Robert Armstrong-Jones, and he made his living taking photographs, and he had a studio in Rotherhithe, south of the river, in a working-class neighborhood that no photographer of his ambition and social access had any practical reason to work from, and that he had chosen precisely because it was the last address anyone would look for him at. The studio mattered. It was not a detail of his biography, but a key to his character, and the character is the subject this part of the account covers. because the marriage this account will examine in the following parts was the marriage of two specific people whose specific natures produced a specific catastrophe, and the studio is where Antony Armstrong-Jones's nature was most honestly expressed. He had two lives: the life above the river, where he photographed debutantes and royalty and the faces of mid-century Britain for the society magazines that paid him, and the life below it, in Rotherhithe, where he slept on a single bed in a converted warehouse space and cooked on a gas ring, and was known to the neighbors as Tony, and entertained a set of friends and intimates whose relationship to the social world above the river was various and complicated and almost entirely undisclosed. The undisclosed part is where the biographies slow down and choose their words, and this account will be precise about what the record holds. Armstrong-Jones's sexuality, in the years before Margaret, was described by people who knew him in that period in terms that multiple biographers, including Anne de Courcy in her 2008 account, have organized around the word bisexual, and the organization is supported by named testimony. He had relationships with women, several of them serious, including a sustained involvement with a model named Gina Ward that overlapped with the early months of his acquaintance with Margaret. He had relationships with men, documented in the accounts of people from the Rotherhithe circle who spoke after his death, and the documentary record of those relationships was, for the period of the marriage, one of the things his Rotherhithe studio was specifically useful for concealing. The court that vetted him before the engagement announcement had access to the same London that his Rotherhithe neighbours lived in, and the question of what the vetting found and what it chose not to find is one that the authorized accounts of the engagement have always preferred to leave in the form of a question. What is documented without ambiguity is the manner of the courtship, and it requires some examination because it was unlike any courtship the institution had previously managed, and unlike anything Margaret had previously experienced. Armstrong-Jones did not pursue her in the manner of the men who had circled her since 1952, the socially credentialed young lords and honorables whose attentions carried the transparent institutional agenda of marrying a princess. He photographed her in sessions commissioned by the palace for official portraits, and the photographs he made were different from anything the official photographers had produced before, because they required her to be interesting rather than regal, which was the one requirement of her nature that the official life never made. She responded to it the way the Crawford documents show her responding to everything that treated her as a person rather than a position, completely, instantly, and without the reserve that the institution spent her childhood trying to install. The courtship was conducted in secret for 2 years, and the secrecy was Armstrong-Jones's design and his maintenance. He compartmentalized with a facility that his Rotherhithe life had developed into a professional skill. Margaret visited the studio without protection officers, arriving in a car driven by a friend, entering through a back door, spending evenings in a building where the neighbors knew nothing beyond the photographer who lived there. The arrangement gave her something the formal life had never provided: anonymity, the ordinary human condition of being somewhere that nobody was watching. She was 27 years old, and it was the first time. The relationship with Gina Ward ended during this period, and the manner of its ending tells something about the man Margaret was falling for. Ward discovered the overlap not from Armstrong-Jones himself, but from the social world they both inhabited, and her account of the discovery, given to biographers, and consistent in its essentials across different tellings, describes not confrontation, but erasure, the calls that stopped, the explanations that never came, the conversion of a serious relationship into an absence so clean it might never have existed. Armstrong-Jones's capacity for the removal of people who had ceased to be useful to him was a quality that multiple witnesses described across his life, and it was a quality his future wife would come to know from the inside. The engagement was announced on February 26, 1960, and its reception broke across the British press with an enthusiasm that owed something to genuine warmth and something to relief. The public had been watching Princess Margaret navigate the post-Townsend years, the late nights and the cigarettes and the thickening social legend, and the engagement of a beautiful princess to a commoner photographer felt, in the early months of 1960, like the resolution of a story that had been building for a decade. Armstrong-Jones was made Earl of Snowdon the day before the wedding. The title was the institution's acknowledgement that a commoner could not walk beside a princess in the Abbey, without a handle, and the acknowledgement was also, the courtiers understood, the first moment at which Antony Armstrong-Jones became a problem the institution would spend the next 2 decades managing. What the palace had acquired, in exchange for the earldom, was a man of genuine talent, ambivalent commitment, and a specific quality of intelligence that the court environment had never previously contained. He was not awed by the institution. He was interested in it, in the way that a photographer is interested in any subject, for what it revealed under the right light. He accepted the title and the role, and the public life, with the surface compliance of someone who understood the terms of the arrangement and had made a private calculation about what the arrangement was worth. The calculation included the access, the resources, the platform for his photography, and the woman herself, whom he found, in the early years, genuinely compelling. It also included an assessment of the marriage's constraints, and the assessment, by the testimony of people who knew him in 1960, was that the constraints were manageable. He had spent his adult life managing constraints through the maintenance of separate worlds. He saw no reason why one more world should be different from the rest. The wedding took place on May 6, 1960, at Westminster Abbey, the first royal wedding televised in its entirety, watched by an estimated 300 million people worldwide, and the footage of it shows 2 people who are, by every legible measure of 2 people in a public space, genuinely happy. Armstrong-Jones's face in the Abbey has the quality that his photographs of her had always caught in her, a person paying attention, engaged, alive to the specific texture of the moment, rather than its ceremonial requirement. Margaret's face has the quality that the Crawford documents first identified in a 6-year-old girl looking sideways at something more interesting than the arranged view. She is present, lit, directed outward, at the man beside her, rather than the institution around her. Honeymoon photographs from the Royal Yacht Britannia, crossing the Caribbean, show the same 2 people, and the mystique visit that the honeymoon included, the 10 acres of Colin Tennant's wedding gift plot, the future site of Les Jolies Eaux, passed as a footnote on a larger journey. Neither of them yet understood what the island would mean, and neither of them yet understood what the marriage would mean, and the gap between the wedding and that understanding was, by the accounts of the people who watched it close, shorter than anyone at the Abbey would have predicted. The cracks, when they appeared first in the structure that Armstrong-Jones had always found most confining, the schedule. As Earl of Snowdon, his mornings were no longer his to organize. His afternoons carried obligations. His evenings, the evenings that the Rotherhithe life had devoted to the company he chose in the city he navigated without a title, were now formal occasions, or they were the evenings of a man waiting for a princess to finish the day's requirements before the private life could begin. He had photographed the institution from outside and found it interesting. He was living inside it and finding it a cage, and the word, deployed by someone who knew him in those years, and recorded by Anne de Courcy, is cage, the precise word, and this account notes it with a specific awareness of where that word also appeared in the documentary record of a marriage examined in the preceding script. 2 cages, 2 borrowed residences, 2 people for whom the institution's requirements filled every available room. The parallels are not coincidental. The institution produced them systematically, and the people it put inside them paid systematically. And the bills arrived, as they always did, on a schedule the institution set and the individuals absorbed. What the absorption looked like, from inside the apartment at Kensington Palace where the couple set up their married life, from the angle of the staff who managed the household, and from the testimony of the friends who watched the first signs appear, is what the next part of this account covers. The first sign was small and domestic, and was described by a member of the household to Craig Brown, with the specificity of someone who had been waiting decades to say it out loud. It involved a dinner, a comment, a silence, and the specific expression on Armstrong-Jones's face that the witness recognized, in retrospect, as the moment the manageable arrangement became something else. The apartment at Kensington Palace that the newlyweds occupied from 1960 was not, by any civilian measure, an apartment. It was a sequence of high-ceilinged state rooms converted, with varying degrees of success, into something that a royal household considered domestic. The ceilings ran to 14 feet. The staff quarters occupied a separate wing. The dining room seated 20 without crowding. which meant that an evening for two required the active decision to use a smaller room, and the smaller room still required a footman, and the footman required instructions, and the instructions required a schedule, and the schedule required agreement between two people who had spent the courtship years specifically free of the obligation to agree on anything. Kensington Palace was, in its architecture, the marriage made physical, grand, formal, staffed, and organized entirely around the requirements of an institution that neither of its newest residents had signed up for on identical terms. Armstrong-Jones took the Sunday Times appointment in 1962, becoming the newspaper's artistic director, and the appointment was read in two directions simultaneously, both of which were accurate. It was read as the act of a talented man, unwilling to spend his adult life trailing a princess to hospital openings, which he was. It was also read, inside the household and by the friends who watched closely, as the act of a man who had identified the mechanism by which the cage could be left on a professional pretext, which it also was. The Sunday Times gave him an office, a schedule, colleagues, deadlines, and the daily disappearance into a working world in which his title was irrelevant and his eye was the only credential that mattered. He arrived home in the evenings to Kensington Palace, and a wife whose day had been structured around duties he was progressively less present to share, and the asymmetry, small at first, widened across the early years of the decade in the way that asymmetries do when neither person names them. The friends who visited in these years, and who later provided accounts to Craig Brown for his 2017 biography, and to Anne de Courcy for her 2008 account, describe the texture of the household in that period, with a consistency that gives the texture the weight of corroborated observation. Meals were formal when they should have been casual. Silences carried freight. The wit that both of them possessed, the quality that had made their early company electric, began to be deployed not as shared entertainment, but as competitive display, each trying to hold a room that the other was also trying to hold, and the competition, conducted in front of guests who were never quite sure whether they were witnessing playfulness or aggression, produced the specific social atmosphere of a household in which the air pressure has changed, and nobody will say why. Margaret's affair with Robin Douglas Home began in 1967 and belongs in the record with the care the record requires. Douglas Home was a Scottish writer, nephew of the former Prime Minister, a man of considerable charm and unstable finances, whose relationship with the princess developed across the months when the Snowdon marriage's private deterioration had become, within a limited circle, an open fact. He kept her letters, which was the act of a man who understood their potential value, and after the relationship ended he experienced the specific variety of despair that follows the loss of an attachment organized around proximity to greatness. He killed himself in 1968, at 36, with an overdose of sleeping pills, leaving behind an estate that included the princess's correspondence. The letters were suppressed through legal intervention and remain in private hands. What they are known to have contained, from the accounts of people who were told their substance by Douglas Home before his death, was a record of a woman's unhappiness specific enough to constitute evidence, and the evidence was never entered into the public record, which suited everyone except Douglas Home, who was past caring. The affair's place in this account is less about its romantic content than about what it reveals of the marriage's condition by 1967, 7 years in. Both parties were now conducting themselves outside the marriage with the freedom that people exercise when the marriage has become a shared performance rather than a shared life. Snowdon's own involvements in this period, documented in the accounts of his social circle and in de Courcy's biography, included a sustained involvement with Lucy Lindsay Hogg, a television producer whose relationship with him would eventually become his second marriage. He began the involvement while still married to Margaret, maintained it in parallel with the marriage's public continuation, and never discussed it with his wife in terms that constituted disclosure. She learned of it the way people learn of things their spouses intend them not to know, through the specific quality of evasion that fluent deceivers develop when they have been deceiving for long enough to become careless. What she did with the knowledge, and what he did with the knowledge of Douglas Home, produced the years of the marriage that Lady Anne Glenconner described in her 2019 memoir, Lady in Waiting, in terms so specific that they require direct engagement. Glenn Connor had been Margaret's lady-in-waiting since 1971, a position of intimate daily proximity that gave her the access to the household's private life that only the most trusted personal staff possess, and what she recorded in her memoir was not the generalized unhappiness of a troubled marriage, but the specific, creative, targeted cruelty that Snowden had developed as his primary instrument of domestic warfare. He stopped using direct confrontation, if he had ever started. Direct confrontation implies a conversation, and a conversation implies the possibility of response, and Snowden was not interested in a conversation. He was interested in the production of a particular effect, the experience, in another person, of being diminished in the moment before they can prepare for it. The instrument he devised for this purpose was the note. Small pieces of paper, written in his own hand, folded, and placed in locations where they would be found not by him, but by her, and found alone, without witness, without the social cushion of company, in the private moments of a day that the formal life surrounded on all sides. He placed them in her books, between pages she would reach in the ordinary progress of reading. He placed them in her gloves, so that the discovery came when she was dressing for an engagement, with the schedule pressing, and the maid waiting, and the car outside. He placed them in her handkerchief drawer, so that the smallest domestic act of the day began with his assessment of her. Glenn Connor recorded what the notes said, and the recording has since been quoted in every serious account of the marriage, and this account enters it once with the precision the primary source requires. One note, found in the glove drawer, read, "You look like a Jewish manicurist, and I hate you." Glenn Connor's commentary on the note is the sentence that every reader of her memoir has paused at. Everybody she had ever met had always treated her with the utmost respect, except Tony, who was spiteful in creative ways. Craig Brown's biography added the note that Glenn Connor's account had not contained, and it is the one that Margaret herself described to a friend in terms that Brown preserved, a note headed 24 Reasons Why I Hate You. The friend's record of Margaret's response to this note is the single most humanizing document in the whole case against her, and it deserves its place here without editorializing. She told the friend, "I can't think of 24 reasons to hate anybody." The woman who had spent 30 years deploying her own wit as a weapon had encountered a cruelty she could not process because its register was outside her experience. She had been cutting, dismissive, imperious, and unkind across those 30 years, in ways that this account will examine in the parts ahead. She had never been this. She had never encountered anyone who sat down and compiled a list. The effect of the notes on the daily operation of the household was what Glenn Connor recorded most precisely, and the precision is what makes her account the primary source rather than a supporting one. Margaret stopped opening her own drawers. She sent her maid first, to check, and the maid understood what she was checking for, and the understanding between employer and employee that this was now a necessary function of the job, never spoken, simply established as a fact of the household, is the detail that places the notes in their correct category. This was not marital discord. It was the systematic production of an environment in which the target could not perform the smallest acts of her own daily life without the intervention of a third party. It was, in the language that a later century would apply to it, a campaign. His behavior in company completed the picture that the notes conducted in private. Witnesses from the dinner tables of the 1960s and early 1970s, gathered in Brown's research, describe a specific performance that Snowden refined across the decade, the correction delivered in front of guests, the anecdote interrupted at its climax, the remark addressed sideways to the table that located Margaret outside the conversation while remaining technically part of it. He was, as one friend put it to Brown, cleverer at being cruel, which is the assessment of someone who had watched both of them operate and reached a comparative judgment. The cruelty was not the cruelty of an uncontrolled temper, it was the cruelty of a controlled intelligence selecting its moments. The rows were the counterpoint. The Snowden marriage became famous for its rows, the volcanic public explosions in front of guests that the couple's social circle learned to anticipate and to manage, arriving at dinner with the specific readiness of people attending an event that might or might not stay on schedule. The rows were not confined to private spaces. Several of the most documented occurred in front of household staff. At Balmoral, in the summers the family assembled there. at Royal Lodge, during visits to the Queen Mother, in the car between engagements, when the morning's accumulated friction required a release point before the public occasion demanded the performance of equanimity. In the summer of 1965, Snowdon cut short a Balmoral visit, leaving the royal family's summer gathering before its scheduled end, the first public signal that the arrangement had entered a phase its participants were no longer fully controlling. What neither of them had calculated, and what the household watched accumulate through the middle years of the decade, was the effect of the private war on the two children born inside it: David, Viscount Linley, born in November 1961, and Sarah, born in May 1964. The children of a marriage conducted in the texture described in this part grow up absorbing that texture in the specific way that children absorb the environments they cannot leave, not through understanding, but through the body's register of what the air in a room feels like when the adults in it are managing something. Both children have spoken, in careful and limited terms, about the experience of their parents' marriage, and both accounts describe a childhood that was, in its public dimension, privileged beyond ordinary measure, and in its private dimension, organized around the management of an atmosphere that required management constantly. By 1970, the marriage was, in the private assessment of the people closest to it, finished. What remained was the question of timing, and the timing was the institution's to determine, because the institution that had produced the marriage was the institution that would have to absorb its ending, and the ending of a royal marriage had not been absorbed since Henry VII, and the methods available to Henry were no longer on the table. What was on the table instead was the island, and the young man who arrived on it, and the photograph that ended the waiting for everyone. The island of Mustique sits in the Grenadines like a rumour, 18 miles southeast of St. Vincent, 3 miles long and barely a mile wide at its broadest point, ringed by beaches of the specific white that exists only in the Caribbean and in the imaginations of people who have not yet been there. Colin Tennant had bought it in 1958 for £45,000, when it was a copper estate of 300 permanent residents and no electricity, and the price reflected what it was, rather than what he intended it to become. What he intended it to become was the private playground of a very small number of very specific people, and the instrument of that transformation was the plot of land he gave the princess as a wedding gift in 1960. Because the presence of Princess Margaret on an island converts that island, in the mathematics of the British press, from a private Caribbean retreat into a story that runs indefinitely. Les Jolies Eaux, the 5-bedroom villa that Oliver Messel completed on the headland in 1972, was the only property Margaret ever owned outright. Everything else in her life, the apartments, the palaces, the Scottish houses, existed in the specific legal condition of royal accommodation, held by the institution and occupied at its pleasure. The Mustique house was hers, on her 10 acres, designed to her specification by the man who was her husband's uncle, and the design reflected what she needed the place to do: provide the experience of being somewhere that did not require the performance of anything. The terrace faced the sea. The bedrooms were simple by the standards of everything else she had ever slept in. Margaret told friends across the years that Mustique was the only place she could relax, and the friends understood the statement to mean something more precise than its words. It was the only place where relaxation was structurally available, where the geography of a private island removed the institutional surveillance that the geography of England made permanent. Snowdon called it mistake. He visited once, briefly, detested it with the thoroughness that he brought to everything connected to his wife's pleasures, and did not return. His absence was the point. Mustique was, among its other functions, the place where the marriage's operational reality could be suspended for the weeks she was there, and the suspension, twice annual, in October and February, was what made the rest of the year bearable enough to maintain. The island's social world in these years was exactly the world the Duchess of Windsor's Paris had been 30 years earlier, and for the same reasons. People for whom ordinary social life carried the specific tax of public recognition had found a place where the tax did not apply, and they paid Colin Tennant's hospitality the tribute of their presence and their behavior. Mick Jagger danced at his parties. David Bowie stayed in his houses. The celebrity set that assembled on Mustique through the 1970s was the era's most concentrated, and its concentrated presence converted the island into the specific environment that Margaret required, a room she could dominate without institutional justification, because the room's occupants had agreed, by arriving, to operate outside the institutional order. Into this world, in the autumn of 1973, arrived a 25-year-old man named Roderick Victor Llewellyn, known to everyone as Roddy, the younger son of a Welsh show-jumping champion, a Harrow-educated, directionless, beautiful young man who had been working, insofar as he had been working, as a landscape gardener. He was brought to Mustique by a mutual friend at a moment in his life that his own subsequent accounts describe as directionless and low, coming off a period of genuine personal difficulty, and he met the princess at one of Tennant's parties in the specific way that people meet at small island parties when the island has 200 residents and the party has 40 guests and there is nowhere else to be. He was 25, she was 43. The 18-year gap was the first fact about the relationship that the press would deploy, and the deployment would organize the public understanding of what the relationship was in ways that the private record does not entirely support. Lady Anne Glenconner, who knew both of them and observed the relationship from the beginning and has written about it with the careful warmth of someone who cared about both parties, described something that the tabloid framing of toy boy and aging princess systematically obscured, that Roddy Llewellyn gave Princess Margaret, in the years when the marriage had become the campaign of notes and public humiliation that the previous part of this account documented, the specific things that the marriage had taken from her. He was kind. He was genuinely interested in her. He made her laugh in the register that the Crawford documents identify as the register she had always needed most, not the court laughter of people performing enjoyment, but the laughter of someone who found her genuinely funny. Glenconner wrote that he gave her back happiness, confidence, and self-esteem, and wrote it as a plain statement of observed fact, rather than as a defense of the relationship, and it reads as such. Snowdon's reaction to the relationship was the reaction of a man who had conducted his own parallel life for a decade, and now found the parallel life producing competition he had not anticipated. He knew about Lucy Lindsay Hogg, and Margaret knew he knew, and the mutual knowledge had been the unstated operating principle of the late marriage's architecture. What he had not calculated was a relationship on Margaret's side that was not the brief, managed affairs of the preceding years, but something she visibly and publicly preferred to the marriage itself. He made unkind remarks from a neighbour's balcony within earshot of Llewellyn's London flat, the remarks recorded by people who heard them and described to biographers with the faint incredulity of witnesses to something they could not quite believe they had seen. The Earl of Snowdon, standing on a friend's balcony above a Fulham street, conducting psychological warfare on his wife's boyfriend through the medium of loud remarks about the garden below. What the institution had made of the talented photographer from Rotherhithe, a decade and a half into the marriage, was this. The photograph was taken in early 1976, on a beach at Mustique. Margaret was wearing a swimsuit. Llewellyn was beside her. The image was not covert, not telephoto, not the product of a journalist in hiding. It was taken by a guest on the island with a personal camera, and it passed through the specific network of people who knew its value before it reached the news of the world, where it was published on February 23, 1976, with the story the image confirmed in 3 column inches below it. The princess was 45. She was technically still married. Her companion in the photograph was 27, and the gap was legible to any reader, and the paper's editors understood that legibility as precisely as they understood everything else about what they were printing. The publication detonated in the specific way that certain stories detonate when they arrive at the exact moment a sufficient number of people have been waiting for them without knowing it. Margaret's civil list allowance was £55,000 per year, a figure that in 1976, in the middle of the decade's economic crisis, with inflation running at 24% and the government approaching the IMF for emergency loans, had an arithmetic relationship to the photograph that no tabloid needed to calculate for its readers. The readers calculated it themselves, and what the calculation produced was not merely disapproval of a middle-aged princess on a Caribbean beach, but a legitimate public argument about what the royal family was for, what it cost, and whether what it cost was justified by what it delivered. Willie Hamilton, the Scottish Republican MP who had called Margaret a floozy in the Commons and repeated his assessment at regular intervals across the preceding decade, found himself, for the first time, in the position of saying something that significant portions of the public were saying privately. Letters reached newspapers. The Commons had questions. The Palace's press operation, which had spent 30 years managing the story of Princess Margaret with the professional discretion of an institution that understood how stories work, found itself managing something it had not prepared for, not a scandal in the conventional sense, but a cost-benefit argument. And cost-benefit arguments do not respond to the management techniques that work on scandals. What the Palace did, and what it did quickly, was convert the cost-benefit argument back into a human story, because human stories can be managed and cost-benefit arguments cannot. The separation of the Princess and Lord Snowdon was announced on March 19, 1976, 24 days after the photograph's publication, and the announcement was timed and framed with the specific precision that royal announcements receive when the institution has had time to prepare them and chooses not to waste the preparation. The announcement converted the story from the princess and the gardener into the marriage that had broken, and a broken marriage, in 1976, carried the specific social vocabulary of human failing rather than public expenditure, and the human failing vocabulary was survivable in ways the expenditure vocabulary was not. The divorce followed in May 1978, the first royal divorce since Henry V, a distinction the press noted and the palace absorbed. And with the divorce came the second shock of the post-photograph years, the financial settlement, which became the template for what the public cost argument would continue to look like for the next decade. Margaret retained her civil list income, her Kensington Palace apartment, her Mystique house, and her staff. Snowdon received a settlement understood to be in the region of £100,000, a sum that reflected both his own earnings and the specific calculation that the institution makes when a marriage ends, and the institution's member cannot be seen to have been diminished by the ending. He remarried Lucy Lindsay Hogg in December 1978, 8 months after the divorce was final, the speed of the second marriage confirming what the social circle had known for years about the sequence. Llewellyn remained in Margaret's life, and the relationship continued in the specific form that the publication of the photograph had permanently altered. It was now a known quantity, managed rather than concealed, and the management came with the specific cost that known quantities carry in the lives of people for whom concealment had been the operating principle. He endured a press attention that his own accounts describe as overwhelming for a man who had not sought public life, and his endurance of it was another of the things that Glenn Connor recorded to his credit. He did not sell his story, he did not give interviews that damaged her. He declined the specific variety of temptation that the press puts in the path of young men who have been intimate with famous women, and the declination, maintained across the years that the relationship continued and the years that followed it, was the act of someone who had understood what the privacy of another person was worth and had chosen to protect it. The relationship ended in 1981, and its ending was quiet by the standards of everything that surrounded it. He married a woman named Tanya Soskin in 1981 and settled into the landscape gardening career that the Mystique years had interrupted. Margaret sent a gift. The gift was appropriate. The years of the relationship, from the 1973 Mystique party to the 1981 wedding, had given her the only sustained period of private happiness that the record of her adult life contains, and the record's evidence for that assessment is not sentimental but specific. She drank less, her health was better. The accounts of the people around her describe a woman whose daily mood had a quality of lightness that the Kensington Palace years had not produced. What the photograph cost, in public currency, was substantial. What the relationship gave, in the private currency that the public version of her life had always spent faster than it could accumulate, was more. The decade that followed, the 1980s, was the decade in which both accounts of Princess Margaret, the public and the private, arrived at their most honest and their most uncomfortable. The public account had been reorganized, post-divorce, around a diminished version of its original proposition, not the tragic beauty, but the expensive obligation, not the brilliant spare, but the cautionary exhibit. The private account was the account of a woman now alone, in the apartment where the notes had been hidden in the drawers, carrying a history that the fire of 1993 would eventually reach, but had not yet. What she did with the decade, and what the decade did to her, and the specific quality of the character that the years had produced by the time her health began to fail, is the subject the next part of this account addresses, through the people who were in the rooms with her and left the most precise records of what being in those rooms was actually like. In the winter of 1993, the photographer and author Christopher Simon Sykes invited Princess Margaret to dinner at his parents' house in the English countryside. The invitation was the kind that her social circle extended and received as a matter of course: a comfortable house, known people, good food, the specific texture of English upper-class hospitality that Margaret had been navigating since childhood, and that she navigated, by her 60s, with the automatic competence of someone who has performed the same social form for 4 decades. She arrived, was shown to her seat, looked at what had been prepared for her supper, and told her host that she did not eat that. The host, by Sykes's own account recorded in Craig Brown's 2017 biography, had spent 2 days preparing the meal. The statement was not a dietary disclosure. It was a reclassification of the host's effort as something that did not require acknowledgement, delivered in the presence of the other guests, at the moment of maximum social exposure for the person who had done the preparing. Sykes recorded the incident not because it was exceptional, but because it was representative, and the distinction matters. An exceptional incident of rudeness is a story. A representative one is a portrait. And what Brown assembled from the accounts of the people who moved through Princess Margaret's social world across the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s was a portrait whose individual pieces are less important than the pattern they compose. The pattern, consistent across unconnected witnesses in different decades describing different occasions, is the pattern of a woman who had identified the put-down as her primary social instrument and refined its delivery to a precision that the recipients, decades later, described with the specific vividness of people recalling an impact rather than an event. The Twiggy incident belongs in the record because it has been repeated so often that its omission would itself be a choice, and because it illustrates the instrument's operation in its purest form. Twiggy, born Leslie Hornby, was by the late 1960s the most photographed woman in Britain, the face of a cultural moment so large that Time magazine had named her the face of 1966. She was introduced to Princess Margaret at a social occasion and received, in place of the conventional exchange of greeting, a single question delivered in the tone of someone who had been interrupted by an irrelevance. "Who are you?" The question was not a request for information. It was a reclassification, conducted in public, of a woman whom every person in the room recognized, into someone whose recognition required the princess's endorsement before it could be considered real. Twiggy, who had navigated the fashion industry since she was 16 and was not without resources of her own, recovered her composure and answered. The princess received the answer without visible response and moved on. The witnesses to the exchange understood, without being told, what had been demonstrated: that in the room where Princess Margaret was present, the coordinates of celebrity ran through her, and a woman famous enough to have her face on the cover of every magazine in the Western world was, until the princess had confirmed otherwise, nobody in particular. Brown's biography, built from 99 chapters because no single frame contained her, is the source this part of the account draws on most extensively, and the drawing requires a note about what the book is. It is not a hostile account. Brown is a careful writer who spent years collecting contradictory evidence about a contradictory subject, and organized it with the specific honesty of someone who found the contradictions more interesting than a verdict. The witnesses he gathered include people who loved her, people who feared her, people who had been demolished by her and came back for more, and people who described her warmth and her generosity and her genuine tenderness toward the people she had decided to love. The portrait that emerges from the accumulation is not a caricature. It is a document of someone in whom exceptional gifts and exceptional damage had been living together for so long that the witnesses could no longer separate them, and the witnesses, assembled in their dozens, agreed on the coexistence more completely than they agreed on anything else. The damage had a specific source. and the source is the one this account has been building toward since the opening hook established the gap between the public version and the private record. The public version of Princess Margaret's character difficulties attributed them to circumstance, the thwarted romance, the purposeless role, the difficult marriage, the public humiliation of the photograph, the decades of being the spare. Each of those circumstances was real, and each contributed something to what she became. What the private record adds, assembled from the people who knew her before the circumstances accumulated, is the observation that the character was present before the circumstances justified it, and the observation suggests that the circumstances and the character were in a relationship more complicated than cause and effect. Crawford had seen it in a 6-year-old at Glamis. The footmen at Windsor Castle had absorbed it through the war years. The household at Clarence House had managed it through the 1950s. What the Townsend crisis, the Snowdon marriage, the photograph, and the divorce did to the character was not create it, but amplify it, stripping away the social constraints that youth and relative uncertainty impose, and leaving what remained, a woman who had always understood that her rank was the one resource that no circumstance could diminish, and who had spent 60 years discovering the specific forms in which that understanding could be expressed. The civil list was the public version of the same resource, and the 1990s brought it into a debate that the palace had been managing at varying levels of intensity since the 1976 photograph. Margaret's annual allocation, by the early 1990s, stood at £219,000, a figure that the Commons returned to with the regularity of an item of unfinished business. Willie Hamilton had retired, but the argument he had put into parliamentary circulation had not, and it found in the post-Thatcher political climate of the early 1990s a new set of voices, less interested in deference and more interested in arithmetic. The argument had a specific shape. The princess carried out fewer official engagements per year than any other working member of the family. Her public duties had been declining in number through the 1980s as her health and her inclination both diminished, and the ratio of allocation to engagement, calculated by journalists who found the calculation straightforward, produced a per-engagement cost that the tabloids rendered in terms their readers could price against their own circumstances. The palace's response to the arithmetic was the response it always made to arguments it could not win on their own terms. It changed the terms. In 1993, the civil list was restructured, with several minor royals removed from it entirely and their costs absorbed elsewhere in the public accounts, and the restructuring converted a political argument about Princess Margaret's specific allocation into an institutional reform of the broader system, which was the institutional equivalent of fixing the roof while the rain was still falling. Margaret remained on the list, her allocation adjusted but not eliminated, and the adjustment was received as a concession that satisfied nobody and was designed not to. It was in this same year, 1993, that she stood in the garden of Kensington Palace with her chauffeur David Griffin beside her and burned the letters. Griffin later wrote about the afternoon with the careful discretion of a man who understood what he had witnessed and what he owed to discretion, but the outline he provided was sufficient. What she had been methodical, unhurried, and without visible emotion, feeding pages into the dustbin fire with the concentration of someone completing a task she had decided upon and was not going to be interrupted from. He estimated 30 years of correspondence. She did not explain what she was burning or why. He did not ask. This was, by 1993, the operating principle of their professional relationship. He drove the car. He stood beside the fire. He did not ask what she was burning, the question this account raised at its opening, and has been accumulating evidence toward, can be approached from two directions. The first direction is practical. The letters that survived the fire, the ones other people kept, the government papers she never held, the accounts of the people she corresponded with, establish a private record that is at variance with the public version on multiple significant points, and a woman who understood how records work, who had watched the Duke of Windsor's files detonate his reputation across 3 decades of posthumous disclosure, who had seen what happened to the letters Robin Douglas' home did not burn, would have had specific practical reasons to ensure that her own private record did not survive her in a form that others controlled. The second direction is more particular and requires the testimony of the people who knew what she was burning toward the end of the period the letters covered. The 1980s, in the private accounts, were the decade in which the absence of the structures that had organized her adult life, the marriage, the relationship with Llewellyn, the sustained social performance of the Snowdon years, left a daily existence whose texture the witnesses describe with a consistency that places the description in the category of corroborated observation. She drank, she smoked through every night. The mornings, by the account of every member of the household staff from that decade who has spoken, began after 11 with the newspapers and proceeded through a routine that the staff had learned to accommodate because the alternative was to be the person who interrupted it. The drinking had been a feature of her life since the 1950s, but the 1980s produced a qualitative change that the people close to her registered as different from what had preceded it. The vodka that she had taken with lunch since her 30s was now preceded by a whiskey that was not always preceded by breakfast. The late nights that her social calendar had always generated were now late nights that the social calendar no longer fully explained. She stayed up because the alternative was a silence that the apartment's 14-foot ceilings amplified and that she was not equipped to sit inside. The insomnia that the household managed around her, the footmen on standby past midnight, the kitchen staff available for the meals she wanted at 1 in the morning, was the institutional accommodation of a woman whose relationship with sleep had been deteriorating since the marriage ended and had not found its floor. The health consequences of 30 years of heavy smoking arrived in the 1990s, with the punctuality of consequences that have been deferred as long as physics will allow. The first stroke came in 1998, on Mustique, and it took from her the use of her left hand, and the taking was, in the specific arithmetic of her situation, the most pointed loss the decade delivered. Les Jolies Eaux was the only place she had ever relaxed, and the stroke arrived there, in the only space the institutional life had never fully colonized, and it arrived as the kind of physical insult that does not reverse. She recovered partially, enough to continue, but the continuing was a different quality of continuing from anything that had preceded it, and the people who saw her in the years between 1998 and 2002 describe a woman managing her own diminishment with the same concentrated professionalism she had brought to everything else. The makeup applied before any visitor arrived, the cigarettes still burning because at 70 she was not going to stop for the benefit of a prognosis. Sir Roy Strong, the art historian and museum director who had known her for decades and attended her funeral in February 2002, left the service and wrote in his diary the sentence that Brown selected as the epigraph of his chapter on her death: "The common touch she had not." Strong was a friend. The sentence was offered as honest assessment rather than condemnation, and it is in that register that this account records it, because the common touch and its absence is the last thing the private record and the public version of Princess Margaret agree on. The public version made the absence of the common touch a function of her circumstances, the accident of royal birth, the burden of a role she had not chosen. The private record, assembled from the staff who served her and the friends who loved her and the strangers she demolished at dinner tables across 5 decades, suggests that the common touch was not absent by accident. It was absent by design, maintained through 60 years of deliberate practice, because the touch that did not condescend to the common was the touch that could not distinguish itself from it, and distinction was the one resource that no civil list reform, no divorce settlement, no photograph, no stroke could remove from the woman in the room. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The second stroke came on the 18th of January 2001 in her bathroom at Kensington Palace, and it scalded her feet. She had been running a bath, and the stroke arrived before she could test the water, and the nerve damage from the heat combined with the neurological damage from the event itself to produce a medical situation that the palace described in the minimum terms and that the people who saw her afterward described in terms that were harder to read. She had lost more of the left side. Her vision had narrowed. The feet, burned by water she had not been able to feel, required treatment that kept her largely immobile through the spring, and the immobility, for a woman whose daily routine had been organized since adolescence around the requirement to appear, was its own category of damage. she was 70 years old. She had been smoking since her teens, 50 years of cigarettes through every hour of every day that the record has any account of, the brand changing across the decades, while the frequency did not. And the medical file that the strokes were annotating was the file of a body that had been managing the arithmetic of those 50 years since the first stroke in 1998, and had been losing the argument since at least the mid-1990s. The doctors who attended her in the final years were the doctors of a royal household, which meant they were the doctors of an institution as much as of a person, operating within the specific constraints of attending someone whose medical condition was also a communications management question, and the constraints produced, in practice, the management of symptoms in an environment organized around the requirement that the management not become the story. She continued to receive visitors through 2001, in the wheelchair that the strokes had made necessary, and the accounts of the people who visited in those final months have the specific texture of testimony from people who were watching something end and knew it, and were choosing, in the moment, what to say and what to preserve for later. Several of them preserved both. The artist Derek Hill, who had known her for decades, visited in the autumn of 2001 and left an account in which he described her asking him, with the directness that the strokes had stripped of its former social insulation, whether he thought there was anything after death. He told her he hoped so. She said she hoped so too. The exchange between them, a woman of 71 in a wheelchair and a man who had spent his life painting the faces of people worth looking at, carried in Hill's account the quality of two people talking without the armor that the social world requires, and the quality was, in the context of everything this account has assembled about the armor she maintained, its own kind of document. The Queen Mother was failing in parallel, and the parallel was the final version of the relationship between the two women that this account has touched at various points without examining directly, because the direct examination belongs here, where both of them were running out of time, and the examination has the benefit of the ending. Their relationship was the most sustained and the most privately complex of Margaret's life, outlasting every other relationship by decades, and its complexity was the complexity of a specific dynamic that the institution produced, and the institution could not resolve. A daughter who was more gifted than her mother, found manageable, and a mother who loved the daughter with the specific compound of pride and anxiety that exceptional children produce in parents who understand what the gifts will cost. The Queen Mother's own public record was the most completely managed of the century, a performance of warmth and duty so total and so sustained that the gap between the performance and the private person became, by the end of her 101 years, essentially unmeasurable. What is measurable, from the accounts of the household staff and the courtiers who served both women, is the specific texture of the relationship between them in the years when they were both declining. They spoke regularly by telephone. They saw each other at the formal occasions that the royal calendar imposed, and at the informal ones that proximity at Royal Lodge and Clarence House made possible. The accounts of those meetings in the final years describe two women who had spent 70 years in the specific relationship of a mother and a daughter in an institution that neither of them had designed and both of them had served, and who were, at the end, simply the last people alive who had been in all the same rooms. The Queen Mother died on March 30, 2002, at Royal Lodge, at 101, and Margaret had preceded her by 7 weeks, dying on February 9th, in the King Edward VII Hospital in London, at 10 in the morning, with her children beside her. She was 71. The order of the deaths mattered in the specific way that order matters in families, where one person's departure reorganizes everything for the people left. Margaret died first, and the Queen Mother died into a grief that the people around her described as the final weight in a sequence of losses that had been building since the King's death in 1952. And the grief was real, in the way that the grief of very old people for the last of their own generation is always real, stripped of the social vocabulary that younger grief deploys, and reduced to the plain fact of absence. The funeral at St. George's Chapel on February 15th was private in the way that royal funerals are private, which is to say that it was attended by the royal family, the government, the diplomatic corps, several hundred representatives of the organizations she had patronized, and the cameras of 3 broadcast networks. The Dean of Windsor officiated. The choir sang the music she had requested, which included, by the accounts of those present, pieces she had chosen with the specific attention to musical quality that her training had given her, and that survived every other deterioration intact to the end. Roy Strong attended and recorded in his diary the observation already entered in this account. Others who had known her across different decades left accounts that agreed on the atmosphere of the chapel without agreeing on its meaning, which is the characteristic of funerals for complicated people. The chapel fills with the versions of the person that the mourners held, and the versions do not resolve into consensus. The estate she left required the resolution that the life had always deferred. The contents of the Kensington Palace apartment, accumulated across 40 years of occupation, included the furniture, the paintings, the objects, the specific accumulation of royal gifts and personal purchases and inherited pieces that constitute the domestic archaeology of a life conducted in the highest register of English material culture. The apartment itself reverted to the Crown, as royal residences do, and was subsequently redesignated and eventually became part of the public areas of the palace. Les Jolies Eaux, the Moustique House, had already been given to her son David in 1996 as a wedding gift and was sold after her death for $2 million. The Jewels, a collection assembled across 7 decades of royal gifts and personal acquisitions, went to auction at Christie's in June 2006, and the sale produced £13 million, roughly doubling the pre-sale estimate in the pattern that the Windsor Jewels at Geneva had established 19 years earlier. The provenance of famous women outperforms every expert projection. The letters she had not burned were the subject of the estate's most delicate management. The correspondence that remained, including the exchange with Peter Townsend that his executors had been careful with, and the letters that other people had kept against her preference, passed into the custody of the royal archives or remained in private hands, depending on their nature and their holder. The specific body of correspondence that would have been most illuminating, the letters she had written to Townsend across the 2 years of his Brussels exile and the 10 days of their October 1955 reunion, exists in the record only as a gap, referenced by the people who were told of its existence, and noted by the biographers who looked for it and did not find it. Whether the gap is the result of the 1993 fire, of Townsend's own discretion during his lifetime, or of arrangements made after his death in 1995, cannot be established from outside the archive. The gap is the gap, and its presence in the record is its own testimony about the specific portions of the private record that the people who held it chose not to enter. What remained after the estate was settled was what always remains after the estate of a famous person is settled: the reputation, in the custody of everyone who holds a version of it, and the versions in circulation at the time of her death were multiple, organized around the specific portions of her life that each version had decided were representative. The television obituaries ran the footage in which she was most beautiful, which was the footage from the late 1950s and early 1960s. The wedding, the Caribbean photographs, the years before the marriage, had produced the decade of notes and public rows that the same obituaries treated in a single bridging sentence. The newspapers ran the headlines from 1955 and 1976, the 2 moments at which her private life had most dramatically intersected with the public sense of itself. The Republican press ran the civil list arithmetic one final time, and the arithmetic, applied to a dead woman, had the specific quality of closing an account rather than making an argument. The people who had served her left, in the years following her death, the most durable portion of the record, because the people who served famous people are the people who were in the rooms where the performance was not required, and the rooms where the performance is not required are the rooms where the person is. Lady Anne Glenconner published her memoir in 2019, 17 years after Margaret's death, and the portrait it contained was the portrait of someone Glenconner had genuinely loved, delivered with the honesty that genuine love eventually produces when the person loved is safely dead and the love's object is the truth of who they were. Craig Brown published his 99 chapters in 2017, and the accumulation of the chapters produced, in readers across multiple countries, the specific reaction that honest portraits of complicated people produce. The recognition after 200 pages of evidence, that the verdict resists formulation, that the person was too much of everything to be contained in a sentence, and that the sentence is what we keep reaching for anyway. The sentence that her biographers keep reaching for, and that the evidence this account has assembled in 7 parts, keeps refusing to deliver in the clean form the sentence requires, belongs to the next part of this account, which addresses the question that the portrait always differs, because the portrait is never quite finished. What was she? What did the institution make of her? And what did she make of the institution? And what does the making of each by the other tell us about the cost of a life organized around the premise that the spare is a lesser category of person, deserving of lesser investment, lesser purpose, and lesser account? There is a specific problem with rendering a verdict on Princess Margaret, and the problem is not complexity, though she was complex, and not contradiction, though she was contradictory, and not the gap between the public record and the private one, though the gap was substantial, and this account has spent 7 parts measuring it. The problem is that the verdict the evidence supports is not the verdict that either of the 2 available narratives will accept, and the 2 available narratives have been competing for the same audience since February 1955, when the world arranged itself around the story of the tragic princess and her divorced pilot, and the audience has never been asked to consider whether both narratives were wrong. The first narrative is the one the institution preferred and the public received. A difficult, expensive, ungrateful woman who squandered every advantage her birth provided, humiliated the family that supported her, embarrassed the institution that funded her, and produced, across 7 decades of public life, a return on investment that the arithmetic of her civil list allocation made available for anyone to calculate. This narrative has the virtue of documentation. The put-downs are recorded, the costs are on the public account, the photograph exists, the draw notes exist, the staff testimony exists. Every piece of evidence this account has entered across the preceding parts supports at least a portion of it. The second narrative is the one her defenders constructed and 5. The Crown dramatized. A woman of blazing gifts, destroyed by an institution that gave her no function, denied her the marriage she wanted, trapped her inside a role that required everything and offered nothing, and then billed her publicly for the damage the role produced. This narrative also has documentation, the Crawford records of the gifts, the 2004 files that rewrote the Townsend story, the Lady Glenconnor memoir that described what the marriage contained, the staff accounts that balanced the cruelty with the warmth. Every piece of evidence this account has entered supports at least a portion of it too. What neither narrative will accommodate is the finding that sits between them, and the finding is this: both verdicts are correct, and they are correct about the same woman at the same time, and the coexistence of their correctness is not a paradox to be resolved, but a fact to be accepted, and the acceptance is what the evidence requires, and what the audience, organized around the preference for a single verdict, consistently declines to provide. Begin with the institution, because the institution's portion of responsibility is the portion that the public record has most consistently underweighted. Margaret Rose Windsor was born into a family organized around a single function, the performance of sovereignty, and was designated from birth as the surplus member of the unit performing it. The surplus designation carried specific consequences that were not incidental to her character, but constitutive of it. She was given, across her childhood and adolescence, every material resource the institution possessed, and no functional one. She was educated to no purpose. She was trained in no skill beyond the social skills that the performance of royalty required, and the social skills were themselves organized around the premise that she would deploy them in support of someone else's principal role rather than in pursuit of her own. The piano she played to the standard of a professional was never directed toward a professional outcome, because the professional outcome was incompatible with her position. The mimicry that her biographers describe as the sharpest they had encountered in any subject was never given a stage, because the stage was the institution's asset, and the institution deployed it for the air. The intelligence that Crawford identified before the girl was 7, and that every subsequent witness confirmed was placed, at 21, in the service of hospital openings and regimental dinners, and the other duties that the spare performs when the principal is unavailable, and was never asked to produce anything commensurate with its capacity. The psychological consequence of that misallocation, sustained across 70 years, was documented by the people who observed it and described, in the aggregate of their accounts, as a specific and recognizable pattern, the energy of a thwarted capability, directed inward and then outward, at the available targets, which were the people in the room, through the available instrument, which was the rank. She could not produce anything with the intelligence the institution had given her nothing to produce with. She could establish, in every room she entered, that the intelligence existed and that the room's other occupants were its inferiors. The put-down was not the weapon of a cruel woman. It was the output of a capable one, with nowhere to put the capability, and the distinction matters because one of those diagnoses is a character verdict and the other is a structural one, and the structural verdict has implications the character verdict does not. The structural verdict implicates the institution, and the institution's response to its own implication, visible in the civil list debates and the coverage of the Mystique years and the management of her public image across 4 decades, was to convert the structural problem into a personal one, to make Princess Margaret the story of an individual's failings rather than an institution's, and the conversion was accomplished with the efficiency that institutions bring to the management of narratives that threaten them. The spare who drinks too much and stays up too late and cannot keep a marriage together and costs the taxpayer £55,000 a year is a personal failure. The institution that created the spare by designating her surplus from birth and then spent 40 years funding her purposelessness without addressing it is a structural one. The personal failure is easier to manage, and the institution managed it, and the management was so thorough that the structural diagnosis did not enter the public conversation until the biographers began assembling it from the private accounts, by which time everyone most directly implicated was dead. This is not an exculpation. The character evidence is too substantial, too consistent, and too corroborated for the structural argument to carry the whole weight of the verdict. The woman who told Christopher Sykes she did not eat what he had spent 2 days preparing was exercising a choice. The woman who received Twiggy's introduction with a reclassification was making a decision about how to use the power the room had given her. The woman whose household staff sent the maid to open the drawers first was the woman who had created an environment in which that procedure was necessary, through a response to her husband's cruelty that was, by the testimony of the people present, its own form of escalation rather than simple endurance. The capacity for cruelty existed before the circumstances that the second narrative uses to explain it, and the capacity was exercised with a creativity and a consistency that the structural argument does not excuse, even as the structural argument explains something the character verdict alone cannot. What the two arguments together produce, held in the same frame, is the portrait of a person for whom the institution's failure, and her own, were so long entangled that the separation requires more precision than either narrative applies. She was failed by a system that gave her no function. She used the absence of function to justify the exercise of rank without accountability. The rank without accountability damaged the people in its path. The damaged people left accounts. The accounts produced the character verdict. The character verdict became the dominant public understanding. The dominant public understanding served the institution by making the spare's story a personal rather than a structural failure, and the institution, as this account has established across 8 parts, was very good at making things serve it. The Crown complicated this arrangement, and the complication is the last piece of the public record worth examining before this account closes its file. The Netflix dramatization, across its 6 seasons, introduced Princess Margaret to an audience born after her death and presented her, in the performances of Vanessa Kirby and Helena Bonham Carter, as the second narrative's fullest realization, the tragic, brilliant sacrifice of an inflexible system, the woman who could have been extraordinary if the extraordinary had been permitted an outlet. The performances were extraordinary. The dramatization was, on the evidence of this account, incomplete, because it required the selection of the evidence that supported the second narrative and the soft peddling of the evidence that supported the first, and the selection produced a Princess Margaret that the staff testimony and the Craig Brown archive and the Lady Glenconnor memoir do not entirely recognize. What they recognize instead is the figure that sits in the gap between the two narratives, and the figure is harder to dramatize because it resists the emotional logic that drama requires. Drama needs a verdict. The gap does not provide one. What it provides instead is the portrait of someone in whom the institution's failure and the individual's response to it produced a compound that cannot be resolved into innocence or guilt, into victim or villain, into the tragic princess or the difficult one, because the compound contained all of those simultaneously, in proportions that shifted depending on the decade, the occasion, the room, and the specific person standing in it, absorbing whatever she had decided to deliver. The person standing in the most rooms across the most decades was Lady Anne Glenconner, and Glenconner's final assessment, delivered in her memoir with the authority of 40 years of proximity, is the one this account places beside the civil list arithmetic and the drawer notes and the 2004 files as the last piece of evidence in the case. She wrote that she loved Princess Margaret. She wrote that the princess was the most difficult person she had ever known. She wrote that the two statements were not in tension with each other. And she wrote, in the sentence that every reviewer of the memoir quoted because it was the sentence that contained the whole portrait in the fewest words, that being with Princess Margaret was like standing next to a bonfire. You could warm yourself at it, or you could get burned by it, and the fire did not adjust itself to your preference. That sentence does what neither narrative manages. It holds the warmth and the damage in the same image, and requires the reader to stand in both at once. It is the sentence of a woman who had spent 40 years in the fire's vicinity, and emerged with the specific knowledge of someone who has been burned and warmed on the same afternoon, and understood both as true accounts of the same source. The source was a woman born into the wrong position, in an institution that did not know what to do with her, who spent 70 years discovering the specific forms in which that wrongness could be expressed, and who expressed them with a completeness that left no one in her orbit untouched, and who left, at the end, a record that is the most complex single document the modern British monarchy has produced, because it is the document in which the institution's cost to an individual and the individual's cost to the people around her are written on the same pages in the same ink, and neither hand is clean. The Kensington Palace apartment where she lived for 40 years, where the drawer notes were planted, and the footman stood through the nights, and the chauffeur watched the letters burn, is now part of the public tour of the palace. Visitors walk through the rooms in guided groups, past the information panels that describe the princess's patronages and her fashion and her famous friendships, and the tour is 40 minutes, and the information panels are accurate as far as they go, which is the distance that public institutions always go, when the full distance would require the tour to be longer and the panels to be honest about what the rooms contained, alongside the fashion. 2 miles away at Westminster Abbey, in a wall of the north choir aisle, there is a memorial to her that was placed there in the year following her death. It is modest, as royal memorials go, her name, her dates, a brief designation. The designation reads, Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, beloved sister of Her Majesty the Queen. The beloved is doing a great deal of work in that sentence, as it always does in the sentences that institutions compose about the people who were hardest to love. It is true. It is also the selection of the evidence that the institution found most useful. One sentence from the 7 parts of this account, and the one sentence that contains the least of what the whole account contains. The whole account is what preceded it. The bonfire is what preceded it. Standing next to it, for 7 parts, is what this account has asked its audience to do, and the standing has produced, in place of a verdict, the thing that honest accounts of complicated people always produce. The specific discomfort of someone who has been warmed and burned in the same afternoon, and understands that both experiences came from the same source, and that the source was real, and that the reality is harder to carry than either narrative provides for, and that carrying it is nevertheless the only honest response to the evidence. The carrying is what the people who knew her did for the rest of their lives. It is what this account has asked you to do for the length of this one. Thank you for standing next to it. In the mid-1960s, when her son Henry was ill and dying of AIDS in the London Lighthouse, a hospice for young men with the disease, at a time when the disease was still producing the specific social terror of the unknown, Lady Anne Glenconner found that her social world contracted with a speed that measured exactly who her friends actually were. People she had known for decades stopped calling. Invitations disappeared. Friends who had been in and out of her house for years discovered, with the suddenness that fear produces, that they had prior engagements. One person did not stop calling. One person arrived at the London lighthouse without a photographer, without a press secretary, without any of the apparatus that royal visits to charitable causes require, walked into the wards, sat with the men who were dying, and made them laugh. The person was Princess Margaret. She had been visiting the same wards quietly for months before Diana, Princess of Wales, arrived with the cameras that made the visit into the image of the decade. Glenconner recorded this in her 2019 memoir, and she recorded it with the specific precision of someone who had been watching both women for years and understood the distinction she was drawing. Margaret kissed her son whenever she saw him, at a moment when physical contact with a person with AIDS was the gesture that sorted the people who understood from the people who feared. She came to his funeral. She never mentioned any of it in public. The same woman whose put-downs this account has documented across 8 parts, the woman of the drawer notes and the dinner table reclassifications, was in the hospice wards of London, without witnesses and without credit, performing a quality of human presence that the documented private kindnesses of her life consistently demonstrate, and the public narrative consistently omits. The omission is not accidental. It is the product of a specific dynamic that Craig Brown identified in his 99 chapters, and that the accounts of the people who knew Margaret privately confirm. The private Margaret and the public Margaret were not in tension with each other, but in deliberate separation, and the separation was her own design. The warmth, the loyalty, the specific quality of friendship she offered the people she had decided to love, was not available for public consumption, because public consumption was the environment she associated with the performance of rank, and rank was what she deployed in public, and the deployment required the persona that the private version had to be kept separate from. The bonfire that Lady Anne described, the warmth and the burning from the same source, was not a metaphor for a character divided against itself. It was a description of a woman who had decided, at some point early enough in her life, that the decision was no longer visible as a decision, that the public self and the private self would operate under entirely different rules, and who maintained the separation with the same completeness she brought to everything else. The private self's generosity ran deeper than the hospice visits, and the evidence for it has been sitting in the accounts of her friends since her death, without receiving the attention the evidence warrants. Prudence Glynn, a fashion journalist who knew Margaret for decades and wrote about her with the intimacy of someone who had spent years in her drawing rooms, left an account in the Scottish Daily Mail of what Margaret had done when Glynn was ordered to bed rest during a difficult pregnancy. She arrived at Glynn's flat, unannounced, rolled up her sleeves, and helped with the washing up. She came back. She grilled Glynn's academic friends about history and politics, with the voracity of a woman who had always known she had been inadequately educated and had been compensating through private conversation for the gap the governess had left. Glenconner confirmed the education complaint in one of the most specific and unexpected testimonies about the private Margaret's self-awareness. The only thing she ever heard her complain about, Glenconner told a journalist in 2023, was that she wished she had been better educated. The Queen had tutors from Oxford and Cambridge. Margaret had the governess, and whatever she could extract from the rooms she was put in, and the rooms turned out to be enough for a mind that absorbed everything it encountered, but the woman who absorbed it knew the difference between what she had been given and what her capacity had deserved. The Royal Ballet Presidency was where the private and professional versions of her gifts most completely aligned, and the alignment produced over 45 years, something that the civil list arithmetic never entered on its ledger, because ledgers measure expenditure and not influence. She became the first president of the Royal Ballet in 1957, at 26, and she remained president until her death, longer than any other single artistic patronage of any member of the royal family in the 20th century. The length is the measure of the genuineness. Patronages that are social ornaments last a decade and are quietly reassigned. Patronages that are sustained by real engagement outlast the people who hold them. The Royal Ballet School placed a plaque to her after her death and had it unveiled by the Queen. Her daughter, Lady Sarah Chatto, took the vice presidency in 2004 and holds it still. The continuity of a family relationship with an institution that began in genuine love for what the institution did. What it did, at the level at which Margaret engaged with it, was produce in performance a quality of human expression that her own position had never permitted her to produce. She had perfect pitch and a musician's training and the specific understanding of physical performance that someone who has spent her life performing, publicly and without choice, brings to the observation of someone performing by choice. She watched Margot Fonteyn and Rudolf Nureyev from the royal box at Covent Garden in the years of their greatest partnership, the 1960s seasons, when the two of them produced what the Kennedy Center would later call the most celebrated partnership in the history of ballet. And she watched with the attention of someone who understood, at the level of the body, what she was seeing. Fonteyn counted her among her genuine friends. Nureyev, who liked very few people without reservation, and said so, liked her without reservation, and said that too. The friendship with Nureyev is the piece of this portrait that the public record has most consistently reduced to anecdote, and the anecdotes, most of them about his bad behavior at her dinner tables and her delighted response to it, miss what the friendship was actually about. Nureyev was a man who had defected from the Soviet Union in 1961 at 23, leaving behind everything and everyone who had made him who he was, and who spent the rest of his life in the specific condition of the exile, physically free and socially displaced, belonging everywhere and nowhere. He recognized in Margaret a version of the same condition expressed through the opposite cage. She had everything the Soviet state would have denied him, and none of the freedom he had risked his life to reach. The recognition produced between them the specific intimacy of people who understand each other's captivity from opposite sides of the wall, and the intimacy was real enough that Nureyev's behavior at her table, the rudeness and the chaos that her other guests found alarming, was the behavior he only produced in the company of people he trusted enough to be himself with. In her drawing room he did not perform. The fact of his non-performance was the tribute. Peter Sellers was another of the private friendships that the public portrait has handled superficially, because the superficial version is funnier. Sellers, by Craig Brown's account, was genuinely in love with her, in the specific way that men of his generation fell in love with women they could not have, and idealized accordingly, and the friendship ran across decades with the warmth and the frustration of people who recognized something essential in each other and could not do anything useful with the recognition. She made him laugh in the register that only a few people in the world could reach, the register of the genuinely absurd, the laughter that comes from the recognition of something true rather than something performed. He died in 1980, and the loss was registered in the private record of her life as a loss, not a social event. Gore Vidal, who moved in her world across the same decades and left some of the most acute observations of British society in the second half of the century, described her intelligence in terms that he reserved for very few of the people he encountered in royal circles. He said she was one of the few royals he had met who was genuinely curious about ideas, who read seriously, who could hold a position in argument and defend it without retreating to precedents. The testimony matters because Vidal was not a man who softened his assessments for social reasons, and his assessment of Margaret was that she was, in the right context, one of the most interesting people in any room she occupied, which is a different statement from the one the public portrait keeps making, that she was one of the most powerful people in any room she occupied. Power and interest are different currencies, and the conflation of them is the conflation that the public narrative has always made about her, organizing itself around what she did with the rank rather than what she was underneath it. What she was underneath it emerges most clearly from the testimony of the people who saw both simultaneously, and Lady Penn's account, given to Anna Pasternak for her research and quoted in Pasternak's 2023 reconsideration, is the most precise of these. She said, Margaret had kindness, intelligence, and a deep sense of duty, and that she was a wonderful mother whose children adored her. Lady Penn's daughter Fiona Wemyss, who had grown up alongside Margaret and observed her across 6 decades, said something that lands harder than any of the more dramatic testimony. She said Margaret was the funniest, warmest, kindest woman she had ever known, and that she had spent her life defending her character because Margaret was so easy to misunderstand. The ease of the misunderstanding is the key. The easiness was not accidental. Margaret made herself easy to misunderstand in public because the public version was the armor. and the armor served a function, and the function was the preservation of the private self that the public version was not allowed to touch. The armor had a cost. The private testimony and the public testimony described the same woman at the same moment producing different evidence, not because one set of witnesses was wrong, but because the woman they were describing had organized herself around the production of different evidence for different audiences. The public audience received the rank, the put-down, the performance of a woman who owned every room she entered. The private audience received the washing up and the hospice wards and the 3 a.m. telephone calls and the loyalty that never once, by the testimony of the people who received it, failed the people she had decided to love. The people she had decided not to love, or had decided were the wrong kind of audience, received something else entirely, and the decision about which category a given person fell into was, by every account, made within minutes of the first meeting, and was very rarely revised. The Twiggy reclassification, and the Sykes dinner, and the Glen Connor AIDS ward happened in the same life, in the same years, sometimes in the same week, and the woman who produced all three was not compartmentalized in any clinical sense. She was consistent. She had simply decided, at a level deep enough to operate without conscious deliberation, that the world divided into the people who mattered and the people who were the audience, and the treatment appropriate to each category was as different as the categories themselves. What it means to hold the hospice visit and the dinner table reclassification in the same frame without resolving them into a single verdict is the question the next part of this account takes to its final resting place, because the question is also the question of what the institution that produced her, and failed her, and funded her, and managed her, and outlived her, has done with her memory since the February morning in 2002, when it had to decide what to do with the evidence she had spent 71 years generating. 6 months after Princess Margaret's death, the Royal Opera House unveiled a plaque to her in the building she had attended more consistently and more genuinely than any other cultural institution in London across 4 decades. The Queen came to unveil it. The ceremony was modest, the attendance limited, the coverage minimal. It was, in the specific register that the institution applies to its management of the recently dead, exactly the right size, large enough to constitute acknowledgement, small enough not to require any of the questions that a larger ceremony would have raised. The questions the ceremony was the right size to avoid were the questions this account has been assembling across 9 parts, and the avoidance was so practiced by now, after 71 years of the same institution managing the same subject, that it had ceased to require effort. The plaque went up. The Queen unveiled it. The coverage moved on. The institution had done what it does, which is to convert the complicated dead into the simply commemorated, and Princess Margaret, who had been the most complicated living member of the family for half a century, joined the long list of people the family had rendered manageable by the act of no longer being alive. The Kensington Palace tour is where the management is now most visible, and the visibility is instructive because it shows the specific selections the institution makes when it controls the archive and the interpretation simultaneously. Visitors to the state apartments walk through rooms that the information panels describe in terms of patronage, fashion, and public duty. The 80 organizations she supported, the Royal Ballet Presidency, the charity work, the military affiliations. The panels are accurate. They describe a real dimension of a real person. They describe it in the specific register of institutions commemorating their members, which is the register of the achievable and the uncontroversial, and they produce in the visitor who has done no prior reading a portrait of a woman of considerable public commitment whose personal life was, the panels acknowledge, complicated. Complicated is the word. It is doing the same work in the Kensington Palace panels that Beloved was doing in the Abbey Memorial. It is the institution's word for things it has decided not to say. What the institution decided not to say, when it had the choice, has been the consistent finding of this account. It did not say, when she was alive, and the saying would have cost it something, that the structure it maintained had given her no function commensurate with her capacity, and had then spent 4 decades managing the consequences of the vacuum it had created. It did not say, when the photograph was published and the civil list debate followed, that the expenditure it was being asked to justify was the expenditure of a system that had no better solution than money for the problem it had made. It did not say, At the funeral, the name of the man who had organized the suppression of the Townsend option in the mythology that the 2004 files dissolved. It did not say, in the obituaries it shaped and the commemorations it designed, that the woman being commemorated had left a private record substantially at variance with the public one, and that the variance was partly its own production. What it said instead was, beloved, complicated, devoted patron of the arts, wonderful mother, loyal sister, and the saying was not dishonest in the way that explicit falsehood is dishonest. Each of those descriptions is supported by the evidence this account has assembled. The beloved is in the Glen Connor memoir, and the Penn testimony, and the AIDS ward visits, and the washing up in Prudence Glynn's kitchen. The arts patronage is in the Royal Ballet's archives, and the Nureyev friendship, and the 45 years of consistent attendance. The motherhood is in the children themselves, in David Armstrong-Jones's public statement that his mother was not the carousing floozy of the dramatizations, and in Lady Sarah Chatto's maintenance of the vice presidency that is the most durable institutional tribute anyone has paid to what the presidency meant. The loyalty to the Queen is in the Glen Connor interview that called it absolute across 70 years, unwavering in public, whatever it contained in private. A loyalty that makes the Harry comparison unavoidable and that Glen Connor made explicitly, contrasting Margaret's silence with the current generation's publication. The Harry comparison is the one the institution least wants made, and that the evidence most insistently produces. Two spares, separated by 3 generations, organized their responses to the same structural problem in opposite directions. Margaret absorbed the purposelessness and the rank without accountability, and the absence of function, and expressed the compound inward and outward, at the available targets, through the available instruments, never in public, never in print, never in a way that named the institution as the source of the compound. Harry named the institution, wrote the book, gave the interviews, and produced in the family and the press the specific reaction that naming produces, the withdrawal of the protections that institutional membership provides, and the conversion of a structural problem into a personal failure, which is the institution's standard response to the naming of structural problems by their products. The comparison does not adjudicate between the two responses. It describes what the institution made available to each person and what each person did with the availability. Margaret's choice, not to name, preserved her membership and her income and her children's position and the public version of the family she had served. It also preserved the institutional structure that had produced the problem in the first place, for the generation that would eventually include Harry, and the preservation is part of the institution's debt to her silence. The Crown changed the public understanding of that silence more than any biography had managed, and it changed it in the specific way that dramatizations change understandings, by giving the silence a face and a voice and a narrative logic that audiences could follow across multiple hours of investment. Vanessa Kirby's Margaret in the early seasons was the most precise rendering of the character this account has been assembling. The wit, the beauty, the specific quality of energy that the public portraits always caught, and the private record always complicated. Helena Bonham Carter's Margaret in the later seasons was the damaged version of the same woman, the consequences of the structure made visible in a body and a face and a voice that audiences had learned to care about. Between the two performances, spanning 4 seasons and a decade of the character's life, The Crown produced something no biography had quite achieved. A Margaret that a generation born after her death felt they understood, and the understanding, as this account has established, was partial, because the dramatization required the second narrative selections and could not accommodate the full file. David Armstrong-Jones, the second Earl of Snowdon, responded to the dramatizations with the specific frustration of a son watching his parents converted into characters, and his stated intention to write a biography that would correct the record is the response of someone who holds a version of the evidence this account does not have access to. What the family archive contains, beyond what has been published and quoted and cited across the biographies this account has drawn on, is the question that every serious examination of Princess Margaret eventually reaches and cannot answer, because the family archive is the family's, and the family's management of it is consistent with its management of everything else. The access is controlled, the disclosure is selective, and the selections serve the version of the story the institution finds most useful. The letters she burned in 1993 are gone. The letters others kept are in private hands or the royal archives. The gap between what exists and what the public record has assembled from what exists is the gap that will narrow over the coming decades as the statutory periods expire and the archives open, and the people who knew her produce the final accounts that mortality is currently still preventing. What those accounts will add to the portrait this account has assembled is unknowable from here. What they will not do is resolve the portrait into the single verdict that the public narrative keeps reaching for, because the portrait is not the kind of portrait that resolves. What it resolves into, instead, is the question that this account has been building toward since the hook established the distance between the public construction and the private record. Not what was she, but what did it cost, and who paid, and whether the payment purchased anything worth its price. The cost to the people in her path, the staff and the guests, and the dinner table targets, was the cost that the public narrative has always found easiest to discuss because it is the most legible and the most entertaining. The cost to the institution was the civil list allocation and the management hours and the press crises and the photograph and the divorce and the commons debates, all of which the institution absorbed with the efficiency of a body that has been absorbing comparable costs since 1066 and has developed systems for it. The cost to herself is the one that sits at the center of everything and that neither narrative has adequately priced, because the first narrative converts it into justified consequence and the second converts it into unjust tragedy, and neither conversion is accurate. What the cost to herself was, assembled from the private record this account has drawn on, was the sustained experience of being the most fully capable person in every room she occupied, and the least able to do anything with the capability, across 71 years, in the most gilded cage the 20th century produced for the purpose. The hospice ward visits that nobody photographed were not charity. They were the expression of a human capacity that the institution had no formal outlet for, directed through the only channel the formal structure could not close, the private one, where she went without photographers and made the dying men laugh and came home to the apartment with the 14-foot ceilings and the empty drawers. The Royal Ballet Presidency was not patronage. It was the closest the institution would permit her to come to being a participant in creative work rather than its observer, and she held it for 45 years because it was the closest she got, and she was not going to let go of it. The piano that she played to professional standard had no audience beyond the drawing rooms she was permitted to play in. The mimicry that made Gore Vidal call her one of the most interesting people in the room had no stage. The intelligence that kept Peter Sellers devoted across 3 decades of genuine friendship had no institution to work through. All of it went into the rooms and came out of the rooms as the performance of rank and the put-down and the cigarettes burning past midnight, and the bill came, as it always does when capability has nowhere to go, in the currencies of health and relationship and the specific quality of sustained unhappiness that one friend described by saying he had never known an unhappier woman, and that Craig Brown organized into 99 chapters because one was not enough to hold her whole. The institution outlived her, as institutions do. It renamed rooms and redirected patronages and continued. The tour at Kensington Palace describes the apartments where she lived. The plaque at the Royal Opera House commemorates the presidency. The grave in the Royal Burial Ground at Windsor, where she was interred after the February 2002 funeral, is in the private grounds, away from the public routes, accessible on the days the family chooses to open them. The location is the institution's final management decision about Princess Margaret, and it is consistent with every other management decision the institution made about her across 71 years, close enough to include, far enough to control. 2 parts remain of this account. One addresses the specific question of what Diana changed, and whether Diana's approach to the same institutional problem that Margaret navigated in silence produced a better outcome for the person navigating it, or whether the 2 women paid different prices for the same structural failure, and the only meaningful difference was which ledger the payment appeared on. The other is the closing, and it contains the sentence that 9 parts of evidence have been building toward, the sentence that neither narrative provides and that the evidence, read whole, requires. When Diana Spencer arrived at Kensington Palace in the summer of 1981 as the new Princess of Wales, the first member of the royal family to organise a formal welcome for her was Princess Margaret. She arranged for the palace staff to line the corridor and applaud Diana and Charles into their apartment after the birth of Prince William in 1982. She took the new princess to the opera. She took her to the ballet, understanding without being told that the ballet was where Diana would feel the specific quality of transported attention that both of them had always needed. She put her arm around the younger woman at family occasions and told people nearby that she could see a kindred spirit, two metropolitan princesses in a family organized around the countryside, two women who found the hunting and shooting culture of the Windsor weekends alien and who made no pretense of finding it otherwise. For several years in the early 1980s, as Diana navigated the specific education that the institution provides for its new members, which is not an education at all but an immersion, Margaret was the closest thing she had to a guide inside the walls. Andrew Morton, who wrote about the relationship in his 2021 account of the Windsor sisters, described Margaret as Diana's unofficial advocate within the family. When Diana struggled visibly in the early years, when the institution's management of her produced in public the specific quality of distress that the institution was not equipped to recognize as its own production, Margaret wrote to the Queen, suggesting that the family cut Diana some slack. The Queen, who avoided family confrontation with the consistency of a constitutional monarch who understands that her personal opinions are institutional assets to be conserved, took the advice. The intervention was real, and its outcome was real. And Diana told Morton years later, "I've always adored Margot. I love her to bits." The friendship lasted until November 20th, 1995, and then it stopped. The date is the date of the Panorama broadcast, the 55 minutes in which Diana told Martin Bashir, and through Bashir the world, about the three people in the marriage, the bulimia, the self-harm, the palace's failure to support her, and her desire to be the queen of people's hearts. Margaret watched the interview from Kensington Palace, in the same building where Diana had filmed it, and the accounts of her reaction, given by people who were with her that evening, and subsequently to Morton, describe a woman who experienced what the institution experienced, distilled into its purest personal form, the sense that the family's private architecture had been publicly dismantled by someone the family had admitted and supported, and that the dismantling was a betrayal. Margaret sent Diana a letter afterward that the accounts describe as scathing. She threw out every magazine in the palace that carried Diana's photograph. She told her children, including Lady Sarah Chatto, who had been genuinely close to Diana, that she did not want them to continue the contact. The friendship was erased with the completeness she brought to all erasures. The reaction needs to be held alongside everything this account has assembled about Princess Margaret's own life, because the holding is where the comparison becomes something more than a biographical footnote. Here was a woman who had burned her own letters, who had absorbed 40 years of institutional constraint in silence, who had converted her grievances into put-downs rather than publications, watching another woman walk into a television studio and say out loud what the institution had done to her, and responding not with recognition, but with fury. The fury was genuine. It was also, and this is the part the simple loyalty versus rebellion narrative misses, the fury of someone who had paid a specific price for a specific silence and was watching someone else refuse the payment, and the refusal retroactively rendered the payment voluntary in a way that the payer had never consented to. Margaret had not chosen silence in the abstract. She had chosen it within a set of options that the institution, the family, the faith, and the public construction of the marriage had collectively reduced to one, and she had spent 30 years administering the consequences of that reduction. Diana had the same set of options and reached for the tape recorder instead, and the reach was available to Diana partly because the world had changed between 1955 and 1991, and partly because Diana was constitutionally incapable of the sustained internal management that Margaret had made her life's work, and partly because Morton had offered her a specific mechanism that had not existed for the earlier woman. The availability does not make Diana's choice a judgment on Margaret's. It makes it a different response to a recognizable condition, available at a different moment in a different life, and the two responses illuminate each other in ways that neither biography alone provides. What the Panorama interview did to the institution was the thing Margaret had spent her life preventing any of her own conduct from doing. It forced the institution to reckon publicly with the gap between its performance and its reality, the gap this account has been measuring across 11 parts. The institution, once forced to reckon, adapted. The things Diana said about her experience inside the palace, the loneliness, the absence of support, the performance required, and the person abandoned inside it, were the things that Margaret's private letters had said in different words, across 4 decades, without ever reaching the institution's ears, in a form that required it to respond. Diana said them in a television studio, and the institution had no choice. Margaret burned the letters, and the institution had every choice, and it made the choices it always made, which were the choices that served the institution. The difference between the two women was not character. It was the difference between a private language and a public one, and public languages force responses that private ones cannot. The outcome for each woman does not adjudicate the method. Diana's public naming did not produce the protection she sought. It produced a divorce, a separation from the institution, a loss of the title Her Royal Highness, that rhymed so precisely with Margaret's lifelong wound that the rhyme was certainly noted inside the family, and then the Paris tunnel in August 1997, at 36. The global grief that followed was the measure of what she had built through the public language, the connection to an audience that no private language could have constructed, and the grief was real, and it was also, from the institution's perspective, exactly the kind of grief that required careful management and was carefully managed. The People's Princess Memorial, constructed and deployed with the efficiency that institutions apply to the conversion of grief into narrative. The narrative produced William and Harry and the generation of royals who were shaped by watching what their mother's method had cost, and who responded in opposite directions, one absorbing the lesson of the institution's precedents, and one refusing it, and the refusal has produced, as of this writing, a book called Spare, and a life conducted in California, and a permanent rupture that is still being managed. Margaret had watched the first act of this sequence and judged it in the specific terms of someone who had made the opposite choice. The judgment was that Diana had betrayed the family. The more precise statement of what Margaret saw was that Diana had abandoned the operating principle that Margaret had maintained across 40 years of grievance, the principle that the family's private reality was the family's private property, and that the maintenance of that property was the price of institutional membership. Diana had refused the price. The institution had ended her membership. Margaret watched this happen 3 years before her own death, and drew no revised conclusion about the choice she had made, the choice this account opened with, the woman standing in the garden with the chauffeur and the fire, burning the private language that nobody had ever been offered, because the public language was the option she had declined. Lady Glenconnor, who watched both women from close proximity across multiple decades, described them once in terms that the interview circuits have not quoted as often as they should. She said Margaret was never a rebel. She was a royalist who happened to be difficult. Diana was never a royalist. She was a rebel who happened to be royal. The distinction is not a verdict on either woman. It is a description of two different orientations toward the same institution, and the institution absorbed and outlived them both and continues. What continues alongside the institution is the legacy question, and the legacy question is where the comparison becomes its most instructive, because the two women's legacies are organized in such different shapes that their difference is itself a document about what the institution does with the people it produces. Diana's legacy is global, sustained, actively managed by her sons in divergent directions, and organized around the public language she chose. The interview, the charity work performed for cameras, the physical contact with the sick and the excluded that constituted her primary political statement. Margaret's legacy is specific, institutional, and organized around the private language she maintained, the Royal Ballet plaque, the vice presidency her daughter holds, the hospice wards nobody photographed, the washing up in Prudence Glynn's kitchen. Both legacies are real. One is visible at a global scale, the other is visible to the people who were in the rooms, and to the biographers who collected those people's accounts, and now to anyone who has read this far. The comparison does not declare a winner. The institution does not declare winners, only survivors, and both women were survivors until they were not, and the manner of each woman's not surviving tells the final thing the comparison has to tell. Diana was 36, and the institution was managing the aftermath of her departure from it when the car entered the tunnel. Margaret was 71, and the institution was managing her gradual diminishment within it when the strokes accumulated past the point of recovery. One woman left the cage and died outside it, young, in circumstances the world has never fully accepted. One woman stayed inside and died inside, old, in circumstances that required careful management, and received it. The institution managed both endings with the efficiency it has developed across 1,000 years of managing endings. The endings are different, the managing is the same. What the managing produces, in the long run, is the record, and the record is what the next part of this account closes with. Not a verdict, because the record does not support one, but the accounting, the specific and honest weighing of what was spent and what was received, and whether the exchange, viewed from the only vantage point that makes the whole of it visible, which is the vantage point of the end, added up to anything that either participant would have called, in the private language they both maintained for different reasons and to different ends, enough. There is a photograph taken at Kensington Palace in the spring of 1999, 17 years after the draw notes, and 13 years after the Llewellyn affair, and 3 years before the February morning when the strokes finally collected their full debt, and it shows Princess Margaret in a wheelchair at a garden party, in a hat and gloves and a coat that required the same attention to detail that every public appearance of her life had required, surrounded by people performing the social ease of people who are not entirely sure how to be in the presence of someone they cannot categorize any longer. She is smiling. The smile is the smile that the Crawford documents first identified in a 6-year-old who understood the difference between a performed expression and a genuine one, and who had spent the subsequent 63 years developing a performed expression so complete that the genuine one was available, by that point, only to the people she had decided to give it to. The photograph shows the performed one. It is impeccable. It tells almost nothing about the person performing it, which was, across 71 years, the photograph's intended function and its consistent achievement. The accounting of what that performance cost begins with the body, because the body is the ledger that does not respond to institutional management. The strokes that arrived across the final 4 years, the scalded feet, the narrowing vision, the wheelchair, the left hand that the 1998 stroke took and did not return, are the body's accumulated record of what it absorbed in the decades that preceded them. 60 cigarettes a day, by some estimates, for 50 years, the vodka from 12:30, the nights that ended after 3 in the morning, because the alternative was the silence of the 14-foot rooms, and she was not equipped, by training or by temperament, to sit inside it. The body absorbed all of it and entered its findings in the only record it keeps, and the findings were delivered on the body's schedule rather than the institution's. The lung surgery of 1985 removed a section of the left lung. She continued smoking afterward. The people around her, who understood by then that the smoking was not a habit in any ordinary sense but a structural feature of the daily life she had constructed around the gaps the institution had left, did not press the point. The gaps were still there. The cigarettes were still the management of the gaps. The management continued until it could no longer manage the body containing it, and then the strokes arrived, and the accounting of 60 years was rendered in the currency of diminishment that strokes deploy, taking function by function, until the institutional performance could no longer be maintained, and then taking that too. What the institution received in exchange for the costs it imposed is the question the accounting requires, and it is a question the institution has always preferred not to be asked in those terms, because the terms imply a transaction that the institution's self-conception does not accommodate. Institutions do not regard their members as parties to a transaction. They regard them as beneficiaries of membership, and the benefits of membership in the House of Windsor are real. The palaces, the allowances, the staff, the access, the protection, the position, the social world organized around the premise that you matter and will always matter. The benefits are substantial. They are also, as this account has established across 12 parts, organized entirely around the premise that what the member brings is worth less than what the membership provides, and the premise, in Margaret's case, was false, and the falseness was the source of everything the civil list debates, and the tabloid arithmetic, and the Twiggy reclassification, and the draw notes, and the burned letters, were expressions of, in their different registers and different directions. What she brought to the membership was a creative intelligence that the institution's own record confirms, at a level the civil list allocation does not come close to compensating. The institution received 45 years of Royal Ballet presidency from someone who understood ballet at the level of a serious practitioner. The institution received 80 patronages, anchored by genuine investment. The institution received a loyalty so total that Glenconner called it absolute, a loyalty that absorbed the Townsend decision, and the Snowdon marriage, and the draw notes, and the photograph, and the civil list debates, and 30 years of being the most discussed and least accommodated member of the family, without once naming the institution as the source of the compound it had created. The institution received the silence, it received the burned letters, it received the private language maintained at the cost of the private person who maintained it. What she received in exchange, the accounting requires saying plainly, was less. A civil list allocation that the Commons debated at regular intervals. An apartment in a palace whose rooms had been designed for state functions, rather than the daily life of a woman who needed, by the testimony of every witness who knew her, the human scale of a kitchen to wash up in, and a friend to talk to past midnight. A title that was hers by birth but which the institution's management converted, across the decades, from an asset into the primary instrument of the public narrative's reduction of her. A role never defined in any document, never given any function commensurate with the capacity available to perform it, never once revised in the direction of the institutional failure that its emptiness represented, despite 40 years of evidence that the emptiness was producing costs the institution was managing, rather than addressing. The Townsend option is where the accounting is most precise, and the precision requires returning to it one final time, because the 2004 files that this account opened with are the document in which the institution's debt to her is most clearly written, and the debt has never been acknowledged. The files show the option was available. The government was not opposed. The Queen was not opposed. The path was open. What the files do not show is what she was thinking in the 3 weeks of October 1955, because the files contain government correspondence, and not the private correspondence of a woman who burned 30 years of her own letters in 1993. What this account has assembled from the indirect evidence, the biographer's accounts of the October meetings, the August letter to Eden admitting uncertainty, the documented gap between the man who returned from Brussels and the man the 2 years of correspondence had preserved, is the picture of a woman who reached the available option and found that it was not, in the specific way she needed it to be, available inside herself. That is not entirely the institution's failure. It is the failure, if failure is the word, of a human being whose formation had produced a specific incapacity at the exact moment the option required a capacity. But the formation was the institution's, the governess was the institution's, the purposelessness was the institution's. The compound that produced the incapacity at the moment of decision was assembled across 25 years of institutional management, and the management's contribution to the October outcome is not visible in the files, because files contain correspondence and not formation, and formation does not file. Andrew Morton's 2021 account of the Windsor sisters described Margaret's education complaint in terms Glenconner subsequently confirmed. The only thing she ever complained about was the education. The complaint, offered across decades in private conversations, rather than in any form the institution was required to respond to, was the most specific statement she ever made about what the membership had withheld. She did not complain, in the private record that survived the fire, about the role itself. She complained about the preparation for it, and the preparation's inadequacy, and the specific gap between what the preparation had given her and what her capacity had deserved. The complaint, read alongside the rest of the private record, is the complaint of someone who had understood for 60 years that the institution had underinvested in her, and had chosen to frame the underinvestment in its most modest available form, because the most modest form was the one the institution could most easily absorb, without being required to acknowledge the structural claim it contained. The absorption was the institution's final art form in relation to her. It absorbed the complaint. It absorbed the civil list debate. It absorbed the photograph. It absorbed the marriage's failure. It absorbed the fire of 1993 and the letters it consumed. It absorbed the strokes and the wheelchair and the performed smile in the 1999 garden party photograph. It absorbed the death and produced the funeral and the Abbey Memorial and the Kensington Palace tour and the Royal Opera House plaque and the vice presidency that her daughter holds. Each absorption converted the preceding difficulty into managed past, the difficulty into the complicated that the Kensington Palace panels deploy, the complicated into the beloved that the Abbey Memorial deploys, and the beloved into permanent commemoration that the institution places on its walls when the person is no longer in a position to complicate the commemoration. But the institution did not absorb everything. It did not absorb the royal ballet, which is what it is, partly because of 45 years of genuine presidential engagement that the institution inherited without designing. It did not absorb the hospice wards, because the hospice wards were never in the institution's possession to absorb. It did not absorb the washing up in Prudence Glynn's kitchen, or the 3 a.m. telephone calls, or the specific quality of friendship she offered the people she had decided to love, which ran outside the institutional channels because it was specifically designed to run outside them. These things were the private record. They are what the fire did not reach, not because she forgot to burn them, but because they existed in the memories of other people rather than on pages, and memory is the one archive the institution cannot manage and the fire of 1993 could not touch. What the private record and the public record together tell, assembled across 12 parts of this account from every available source, is not the verdict that either narrative offers. It is something harder and more honest, the portrait of a person for whom the institution's failure and her own were so long entangled that the separation requires more precision than either narrative applies. She was failed by a system that gave her no function. She used the absence of function to justify the exercise of rank without accountability. The rank without accountability damaged the people in its path. The damaged people left accounts. The accounts produced the character verdict. The character verdict became the dominant public understanding, and the dominant public understanding served the institution by making the spare's story a personal rather than a structural failure, and the institution was very good at making things serve it. This is not where the accounting ends, however. It ends where the evidence points, which is not in the civil list arithmetic, or the gallery of put-downs, or the formal commemorations, or even the honest structural diagnosis, but in a ward in the London Lighthouse in the mid-1980s, where a woman in her 50s is making dying men laugh, without a camera, without a photographer, without a press secretary, without the institutional identification that would have converted her presence into currency. She will leave and tell no one. The room will not appear in any archive. The institution will not manage it, because the institution does not know it happened, and in the space that the institution cannot enter and the fire cannot reach, in the room that love kept, rather than the one the records kept, is the portion of the accounting that the public version of Princess Margaret was built to prevent the world from reaching. There is more to account for. The children who grew up inside the palace she ran, and who carry in their adult lives the specific compound of what it meant to be raised by her and inside it, are the next part of what this account assembles. Because the institution that shaped her, shaped them too, through her, and what it produced in the generation she was responsible for, is the final evidence of what the whole formation cost, paid forward into the people who did not choose it and could not leave it, and are carrying it still. In the spring of 1985, Princess Margaret arrived unannounced at a small shop in Chelsea. Her son David had opened it that year, a furniture workshop he called David Linley Furniture Limited. Its premises modest enough that the stock required assembling, and when she walked down the stairs, she found him working on the floor. What happened next has been told by David himself in a Vanity Fair interview in 2017, and it is told because it contains in a single scene more information about the mother-child relationship than most of the formal accounts manage in their entirety. Margaret sat down on the floor beside him, picked up a screwdriver, and began fastening a screw into the back of a mirror. She stayed until the job was done. She said nothing about the location, or the smallness of the premises, or the absence of the staff and the ceremony that attended everything else in her life. She was, by her son's account, greatly enthusiastic. The scene is the counterweight to everything the preceding 12 parts have assembled, and it is a genuine counterweight, rather than a sentimental one, because it was witnessed and recorded, and is corroborated by David's consistent account of his mother across the 3 decades since her death. It shows a woman who, in the private channels that the institutional performance never colonized, expressed toward her children a quality of presence and investment that the public version of her character had trained most observers not to expect. The floor of the Chelsea shop, like the London Lighthouse wards and the kitchen in Prudence Glynn's flat, was a room the institution did not enter, and in the rooms the institution did not enter, a different person operated, and the different person was, by the testimony of the people who received her there, worth the wait. The children she raised were the most intimate record of what the Kensington Palace years had actually produced, because children absorb the households they grow up in, at a level that precedes analysis, and the adults that absorption produces are the evidence the household itself cannot falsify. David Armstrong-Jones and Sarah Armstrong-Jones, born in 1961 and 1964 into the 20-room apartment that their parents occupied in Kensington Palace, grew up inside a household that was simultaneously one of the most creatively stimulating private environments in London and one of the most atmospherically complicated. The stimulating dimension is documented in David's own accounts, the famous people who passed through, the conversations that covered art and music and politics and design at a level that a formal education could not have replicated, the specific quality of intellectual provocation that Margaret brought to her drawing room and directed, in the private hours, at the children who were present in it. He told an interviewer in 2018 that he loved being around his mother, that in the house were very interesting people from all walks of life, and that there was creativity and music. The account is the account of a man who is being honest rather than diplomatic, and the honesty is the specific honesty of someone whose formation it is possible to trace in what they subsequently built. What David built was a furniture company, grounded in the principle that beautiful things made by hand carry the specific authority of a maker's engagement with material, and the principle is recognizable as the inheritance of 2 parents whose professional identities were both organized around the relationship between a practitioner and a physical medium. His father's photography and his mother's piano had in common the requirement of a specific technical skill developed through practice, to the point where the technique becomes invisible inside the work, and David's furniture carries the same quality. The Queen Mother circulated one of his first pieces, a decorative box made at Bedales School that impressed his teacher, as a cigar box at family gatherings, which is the specific form of royal family endorsement that operates below the level of public ceremony and above the level of ordinary domestic approval. He studied at the School for Craftsmen in Wood at Parnham House, and the choice of a vocational training over a university education in the context of a family in which the university degree was the standard credential for the male heir's serious consideration is a choice that the household he grew up in made possible, because the household's operating values placed craft and creative work alongside intellectual distinction as legitimate outcomes for a person of ability. He credits his father for the design inheritance, and the credit is documented and specific. He told The Telegraph that he inherited his love of design from Snowdon, who was always fascinated by pushing the boundaries of an object. He credits his mother for the enthusiasm, and the Chelsea shop scene is the evidence. The credit lines tell something about the specific achievement of the household in its most private dimension. Despite 18 years of the marriage described across 4 parts of this account, a marriage that produced draw notes and public rows, and mutual infidelity, and a divorce that the 14-year-old Sarah found deeply distressing, what the 2 children came away with was not primarily the damage of the marriage, but the creative inheritance of both parents, deployed in careers that reflect what Margaret and Snowdon separately brought to the household, rather than what they did to each other inside it. The separation of those 2 things, the inheritance from the damage, is not the automatic product of a loving household. It is the product of a specific parenting effort made inside a difficult household, and the effort was Margaret's as much as Snowdon's, and the evidence for it is the children. Sarah is the evidence most worth examining at length, because Sarah is the child in whom the specifically Margaretian inheritance is most legibly inscribed, and because Sarah's adult life is the closest available index to what Margaret might have built if the institution had given her the tools to build it. She was born on the 1st of May 1964 at Kensington Palace, the younger child, the daughter, the one whose relationship with her mother the biographies consistently describe as the closest and most sustained of the two parental relationships. The closeness was the closeness of similarity. Sarah had Margaret's aesthetic sensibility, Margaret's love of the visual, Margaret's specific relationship to creative work as the activity that makes a person more fully themselves rather than less, and the similarity created between them, the specific intimacy of a parent and child who recognize each other without requiring explanation. She attended Bedales, the progressive Hampshire school that both she and David chose, and Bedales is itself a document of the parenting decision behind it. Bedales was not the conventional choice for royal children of her generation. It was coeducational. It was organized around creative and independent learning rather than the hierarchical discipline of the traditional public school, and it produced in its students a quality of self-directed intellectual engagement that the conventional alternatives did not prioritize. The choice of Bedales for both children, in a family in which one parent had complained across her entire adult life that she had been inadequately educated, and in which the other parent had himself built a professional identity on creative skill rather than conventional credentialing, was the choice of parents who had understood what the education system could and could not provide, and had selected for what they most valued. From Bedales, Sarah went to Camberwell School of Art and then to Middlesex Polytechnic, and the trajectory is the trajectory of a person who understood from early enough to act on it that the creative identity was not the supplement to the serious life, but its center. She has exhibited at the Redfern Gallery in London since 1995, under her professional name Sarah Armstrong-Jones, working primarily in portraiture and figurative art, and she won the Windsor and Newton Prize in 1988 and the Creswick Landscape Prize in 1990 while still a student. The prizes are significant, not because prizes are always significant, but because these ones were won on the merits, without the name, in the specific context of a school assessment that did not know or care that the person submitting the work was the daughter of Princess Margaret. The quality of the work was the credential, and the quality was sufficient. It is the credential that Margaret, born into the same artistic intelligence in a different generation, was never permitted to seek. The Royal Ballet Vice Presidency that Sarah took in 2004, following her mother's 45-year presidency and her cousin Charles's brief stewardship of the role between 2003 and 2024, when Sarah herself assumed the presidency, is the institutional thread that runs from mother to daughter in the most visible available form. The thread connects the woman who attended opening nights at Covent Garden for decades with genuine practitioner's understanding, and the woman who studied at the Camberwell School of Art and has spent 30 years making portraits, through the specific institution that both of them understood as the place where human creative capacity is developed and exercised to its fullest extent. Sarah became president of the Royal Ballet in 2024, the position her mother had held from 1957 until her death, and the institution thus passed from one woman to the other across a gap of 22 years, with Charles as the interim holder, which is to say that the Royal Ballet has been in the custody of Margaret's direct line of inheritance for nearly 70 years. The institution received Margaret's 45 years and is now receiving Sarah's, and the continuity is the most durable monument to what the parenting of the Chelsea shop floor and the Bedales Choice and the Redfern Gallery prizes actually built. David moved back to Kensington Palace in 2000, bringing his wife Serena and their infant son Charles to live with his mother in her final 2 years. The move was the act of a son who understood that the woman who had screwed the mirror into the back of the furniture in his first shop in 1985 was no longer able to manage the apartment alone, and who chose proximity over convenience at the moment the proximity was required. He lived there until her death in February 2002, and the living there was the private record of the relationship's final chapter, the son in the apartment where the formation had happened, watching the end of the woman who had shaped the formation, and the watching was the specific form of loyalty that the public version of Princess Margaret's character never predicted, and the private record consistently confirms. Margaret said, "Across the years of the children's lives, one thing about their position that has been quoted in the family's subsequent accounts, and that carries, in the context of everything this account has assembled, more weight than its apparent casualness suggests. She said, 'My children are not royal, they just happen to have the Queen for their aunt.' The sentence is a description of a parenting decision rather than a fact, because the children were royal in every technical sense, born into the family at the precise generation where the title and the position and the institutional weight applied. What she was describing was the environment she chose to create for them, one in which the royal position was the family connection rather than the definition, and the definition was available to be made by the people who had grown up inside the house on the floor with the screwdriver and the mirror and the creative inheritance of two parents whose gifts she had spent 70 years demonstrating the institution could not adequately contain. The adequacy question is the one the children's lives answer most directly, because the children were given what the institution had denied their mother, the educational investment commensurate with their capacity, the vocational freedom to pursue what that capacity required, and the parental permission to build an identity around the work, rather than around the position. The building produced a furniture maker of genuine international reputation and a painter of sufficient quality to win prizes on merit in open competition. And the building was done by two people who grew up in the most surveilled domestic environment in England, without the surveillance determining what they became. What produced that outcome? In a household that the preceding parts of this account have documented as containing the drawer notes and the rose and the Mystique photograph and the divorce at 14 and the institutional pressures that Margaret had absorbed for her entire life before the children were born, is the question that the private record of the parenting answers in the specific terms of the Chelsea shop and the Bedales choice and the Redfern Gallery and the Royal Ballet. The answer is that the quality of the creative environment she built for them inside the institution's architecture was the thing she most completely succeeded at, and the success is the most personal monument to everything the institution had prevented her from building for herself. The building she could not do for herself, and the specific dimension of the institution's failure that her children's lives illuminate by contrast, is part of what the next section of this account addresses. But before the final accounting is closed, one further territory of her life remains unexamined: the relationships she conducted outside the family, across 4 decades, with the men and women of the arts world who constituted the social life that kept her genuinely alive inside the institutional cage, and who left, in their published accounts and their private testimony, the most specific descriptions of what she was like when the institution was not in the room. Cecil Beaton attended a dinner at Kensington Palace in the spring of 1965 and wrote about it in his diary the following morning with the specific precision that his diaries always brought to the people he found worth examining, which was most people, and to the people he found worth examining twice, which was very few. Margaret was one of the twice people. Beaton had known her since her childhood, had photographed her across 3 decades, and had watched her from the inside of the artistic and social world she inhabited with a professional observer's eye that the friendship never entirely softened. What he recorded from the 1965 dinner was not the performance of the evening, the wit and the music and the famous guests and the food that everybody always mentioned, but the specific quality of attention she brought to a conversation about a painter whose work nobody else at the table had looked at closely enough to have an opinion. She had looked. She had opinions that Beaton, whose opinions about painting were themselves the opinions of someone who had spent 50 years in the company of painters, found surprising in their precision and their independence. He wrote that she was, when she forgot she was performing, the most interesting person he had been in a room with in months. The qualification is the document, when she forgot she was performing. Kenneth Tynan, the theatre critic whose reviews in The Observer and later the National Theatre's literary managership made him the most influential single voice in British theatrical life across the 1960s, encountered Princess Margaret at a series of social occasions through that decade and left accounts of the encounters in his journals, published after his death, that stand alongside Beaton's diaries as the most specific available descriptions of what she was like in the company of people whose intelligence she respected and who did not require the performance. Tynan's Margaret is the Margaret of those rooms, argumentative, specific, willing to defend a position under pressure from someone who had read more and thought harder, and, in the quality that Tynan found most unusual in the context of her position, genuinely curious about whether she was wrong. She could be told she was wrong. She would push back. She would occasionally concede. He described her, in one entry that has been quoted in the critical literature around his journals, as the only member of the royal family he had ever spoken to who understood that a conversation was a form of inquiry rather than a form of performance. And the description, from a man who spent his professional life measuring the difference between performed intelligence and genuine intelligence, carries the weight of a practiced judgment. John Betjeman, whose poetry about England's suburban landscape and Anglican churches and the specific textures of middle-class English life made him the most widely read serious poet of his generation, developed across the 1960s and 1970s a friendship with Margaret that the accounts of both sides describe as one of the genuine intellectual relationships of her adult life. Betjeman loved the Church of England with the passion of a convert who had thought his way into the faith rather than inherited it, and Margaret loved it with the specific passion of someone for whom the faith was the private counterweight to the public performance, the one space the institution occupied without managing. Their conversations, described by people who were present at the gatherings where the two of them fell into the specific absorption of people who have found the other person's mind a place they want to stay in, ranged across architecture, poetry, faith, and the specific quality of Englishness that Betjeman had made his life's subject, and that Margaret, born into its most extreme institutional expression, had spent her life existing inside without being able to examine from outside. Betjeman provided the outside view. She provided the inside testimony. The exchange between them, by the accounts of the people who observed it, was the most complete intellectual transaction either conducted in that social world, and it ran for 2 decades, sustained by the specific quality of mutual usefulness that only genuine friendship provides. Patrick Lichfield, the photographer, and Earl, who was also the Queen's cousin and one of the more observant chroniclers of the social world he inhabited professionally and personally, left accounts of Margaret across the 1970s and 1980s that add a dimension the arts world testimony does not provide, the specific texture of her relationship to her own appearance, and what the management of that appearance across 50 years of being one of the most photographed women in the world had actually cost. Lichfield photographed her for publications and for private occasions across 2 decades, and what he observed, from the specific vantage point of someone who understood cameras and subjects professionally, was that she was simultaneously the most sophisticated subject he had ever worked with, in the sense of understanding exactly what the camera required, and delivering it with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it since childhood, and the subject most exhausted by the requirement. He described occasions, in his private accounts rather than his published work, when the photograph was taken and the professional engagement ended, and she deflated, physically, in the specific way that people deflate when they have been performing something they are very good at, and the performance is over, and the person underneath it is tired, in a way that no amount of rest resolves. The deflation was not the deflation of someone who disliked the camera. It was the deflation of someone who had been at work for a very long time, and for whom the work had never stopped. Mick Jagger's Mystique connection ran through Colin Tennant and produced, across the 1970s and into the 1980s, a social overlap with Margaret that the island's specific geography made intimate in ways that the London social world's scale prevented. On Mystique, 200 permanent residents and a rotating cast of the famous meant that the boundaries between social tiers flattened in the specific way they flatten in small places where everyone eats at the same bar and walks on the same beach. Jagger attended Tennant's parties, at which Margaret was present, and both of them attended the informal late evenings at Basil's bar that were the island's real social institution. Basil Charles, the bar's owner and the island's most reliable chronicler of the famous people who passed through his establishment, described Margaret and Jagger in the same social space as 2 people who found each other mutually interesting for the same reason. Each was the most famous version of something the other had never been, and the mutual curiosity was the basis of a social ease that their respective contexts in England would not have produced. She was the most famous royal, he was the most famous rock musician. On Mystique in the 1970s, those were equivalent credentials, and neither cancelled the other. What all of these relationships had in common, from Beaton's dinners, to Tynan's argument, to Betjeman's theological conversations, to Litchfield's professional observations, to Jagger's bar evenings, was the quality that this account has been circling across 14 parts without quite naming in isolation, because naming it in isolation would have been premature before the surrounding evidence was assembled. The quality is the quality of a person who was, in the right context, more fully herself than the institution that produced her had ever intended her to be. The institution intended a princess. It produced a princess who was also a woman of genuine intellectual and creative engagement, and the woman survived the princess across 71 years and is documented in the accounts of the people who encountered her, in the specific rooms where the princess was temporarily off duty, with the consistency of corroborated observation. The consistency is the final piece of evidence that the accounting of Part 12 left open. It established what the institution received and what it gave, and it established that the exchange was unequal in her disfavor. What it did not establish, because the establishment required the evidence assembled in Parts 13 and 14, was what the private life produced that the public version was not designed to contain. The answer, assembled from the Chelsea shop and the Redfern Gallery, and the Betjeman conversations, and the Beaton diary entries, and the Tynan journal, and the Mystique bar evenings, and the London lighthouse wards, and the hospice visits, and the washing up in Prudence Glynn's kitchen, is the answer that neither narrative provides, because neither narrative has the access to the rooms where it was produced. What it produced was a life that the public version consistently underestimated, because the public version was organized around the civil list allocation and the photograph, and the draw notes, and the Twiggy reclassification, and the tabloid arithmetic, all of which are real, and all of which are partial. And the partial reading produced the caricature, and the caricature produced the dominant public understanding, and the dominant public understanding served the institution by making the Spares story a personal failure rather than a structural one. And the institution was very good, as this account has established from its opening pages, at making things serve it. The spare who drinks too much and stays up too late and costs the taxpayer £55,000 a year and cannot keep a marriage together is a personal failure. The institution that designated her surplus from birth and funded her purposelessness for 40 years without addressing the purposelessness is a structural one. The personal failure is manageable. The structural one requires the institution to acknowledge that the management decisions it made over 7 decades produced in one of its members costs that the member paid and the institution did not. The acknowledgement has not been made. The Kensington Palace panels say complicated. The Abbey Memorial says beloved. The Royal Opera House plaque says president. Each of these is accurate. None of them says what the evidence assembled across 14 parts of this account says, which is that the institution received from Princess Margaret a silence worth more than it paid for, and paid for it less than it cost, and managed the gap between what it paid and what it owed, with the efficiency it has always applied to the management of gaps. The efficiency produced, in the management of her public legacy, the same result it always produces. A version of the person organized around what the institution found most useful, which was the complicated, beloved, devoted patron of the arts, and a suppressed version, organized around what the institution found least useful, which was the full account of what the 45 years of devoted patronage and the loyalty that Glenconner called absolute and the silence that preserved the family's private architecture had cost the person who provided all of it. The full account is what this account has been. 14 parts, assembled from the biographies and the diaries and the government files, and the released correspondence, and the staff testimony, and the friends' memoirs, and the children's interviews, and the institution's own records, organized around the distance between the public version and the private one, the distance this account measured from its first sentence to its last. The distance is not a verdict, it is a measurement, and measurements do not judge, they describe, and what the measurement describes is a woman who was more than the institution made room for, and less than the institution's management of her legacy acknowledges, and exactly as complicated as the evidence requires, and not a sentence more. She stood in a garden in 1993 and burned 30 years of her own letters. Her chauffeur stood beside her and watched. The fire produced no verdict. It consumed evidence, as fires do, and left the gap that fires always leave, the space where something was, visible in outline, defined by what surrounds it, rather than by what it contained. The gap is in the public record now, shaped by the 14 parts that attempted to measure it from the outside, and the shape the measurement produces is not the tragedy, and not the caricature, and not the beloved, complicated, devoted patron. It is the shape of a person who was in the room, fully, in all the rooms this account has entered, and who left each one changed by the having been in it, and who burned the letters because she understood, better than anyone, the difference between the evidence the institution wanted in the record and the evidence the record actually required. The evidence the record required is what you have just read. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.